Good morning and welcome to the first session of today's conference, Brooklyn Waterfront Research Center. Thank all of you who are returning after last night's stimulating conversation. If you were not here, you missed quite a good conversation last evening, and it was a good way to start this conference. Today, we have an exciting lineup for you. We have two sessions. We introduced the topic, we framed it yesterday, of how scientists were the ones to identify climate change, but they're not the ones only who are going to fix it or talk about it or help alleviate the climate crisis. And so artists, among others, have some role to play. And today we're focusing on the role of artists in addressing climate change and as they interact with science and scientists. And we have the two panels today. The first will speak about the educational component of this. And then the second panel, we will have working artists who will talk about their work. So we've labeled the learning at the intersection and working at the intersection of art and science. And I would like to present now our moderator for this session, Graciela Flores, who is a science educator, the founder of Kids Talk Science, a program where elementary school children learn science through hands-on activities and explain what they have learned through videos and animations, thus combining the science and the art. Flores has a BS, Bachelor's in Science in Biology, and a PhD in Animal Behavior from the University of Buenos Aires, and a master's degree in Science Journalism from New York University. She's the author of several biology books for students and teachers, as well as science articles for general public in English and Spanish. She's taught science to undergraduates, teachers, and children, and it's my pleasure to welcome Graciela Flores.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome everybody. I'm thrilled to be the moderator for this session. Yesterday evening in the roundtable discussion, artists and scientists talked about the role of science and art and its intersection in the present climate crisis. In today's first session, we'll resume that discussion, this time with an artist and three educators who use approaches across the arts and sciences to understand and communicate ideas often related to climate change and its consequences. I will present each of the panelists, who will then have 15 minutes to introduce themselves and tell us about what they do. After the presentations, there will be time for a group discussion, and then we'll transition into questions from the audience. And I will start with Beth Tuck. Beth Tuck is the executive director at GenSpace, the world's first community biology lab. GenSpace is a place where people of all backgrounds can learn to use the tools of life sciences and then create their own projects. Previously, Beth was a genomics education specialist at the National Human Genome Research Institute, where she worked on enhancing K-16 genomics literacy, education and community engagement as well. Her work included designing curricular resources, engaging students and teachers in hands-on genomics activities, supporting teacher professional development, and training scientists in public engagement skills. Her graduate research at Washington University in St. Louis focused on the genetics and molecular mechanisms of neurological and neuromuscular disorders. Welcome, Beth.
Hi, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. I'm so happy to be with you and to be able to share a little bit about GenSpace and what we do and how we engage artists, scientists, and many others. So I'm really grateful to have this time with you all today. Thank you. So thank you for that very kind introduction. I think you summed it up really well. So I don't really know if I need to do this whole talk, but I'll do my best to share a little bit more about what we do at GenSpace and how we approach the concept of mutual learning in our community lab. So GenSpace, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a community science lab. I'm actually here at the lab. You can see behind me. And I'm happy to give anybody a tour once we're fully reopened later on this spring. We are a community of people. That's fundamentally what GenSpace is a community of people: students, teachers, immigrants, locals, retirees, PhDs, artists, designers, scientists, families, entrepreneurs, neighbors, travelers, more. We are a group of people who come together from whatever background people come from, with whatever knowledge and skills they bring to the table to make science possible here in our neighborhood. We're outside of traditional academic and industry space with the intention of having an independent lens with which we can pursue these kinds of inquiries, projects, passions, and make this kind of science more accessible to everyone. We really believe that biology, life sciences is changing the world, and we want to make sure that that information and that knowledge and that skills is distributed equitably, and make sure that everybody has a chance to have a voice in that conversation. So we work with high school students, we work with designers, we work with artists, we work with entrepreneurs, and all of these people can find a home at GenSpace. The origin story of GenSpace is an inherently interdisciplinary one. An artist, a journalist, and a scientist got together in a living room and said, you know, this whole biotech thing is coming fast and furious, and how can we make sure that we create space where people can experience this stuff if they're not in a traditional academic setting. And so they got together in Dan Grushkin's living room and started experimenting with E. coli, and then very quickly realized that they needed a safer space to be able to do this kind of experimentation. So they opened up GenSpace in downtown Brooklyn. And again, to point to the kind of critical pivotal role that artists have played, one of the co-founders is Nurit Bar-Shai, who is a pretty well-renowned bioartist who makes some really beautiful microbial art. And definitely has been, the arts have been a critical element of GenSpace's identity from the beginning. So yes, we are the world's first community lab. We're a model for open access science rooted in the neighborhood. We try to make the tools and technology, mentorship, and models accessible to everyone who's interested. We work with the Brooklyn Bridge Park. We've worked with BioBat. We've worked with a lot of different organizations, again, to try to bring this kind of science and make it more accessible to everyone. So this is a quick visual of the lab. You can see that we have the same kinds of tools and technologies that you would find in a traditional academic research lab. But for me, as a traditionally trained scientist, I would never find kombucha brewing next to my favorite E. coli strain. And so that is a really unique thing about the way that GenSpace operates, is you'll find kind of people who are collaborating with their critters in very unusual and unique ways. That was never something that was part of my experience as a traditional academic. And again, just to kind of like connect with the theme of the conference, where we are kind of on the Brooklyn Waterfront. We're in Sunset Park, and we're just about 2 blocks away from the Bush Terminal Park. And this is Leticia, one of our previous team members, who is there at the park. And so, you know, we do have a lot of love for the waterfront, and we're really excited to be able to do more, both intentional inquiry and research with the waterfront, as well as kind of creative artistic practice. So we'll share a little bit more about some projects that we've done recently that have connected, and you'll hear more about that from Simone later this afternoon. So this is our team. We have an incredibly talented, wonderful group of humans that do this work. We have Jasmine Allen, who will be with us to answer all the wonderful Q&A later. As our education manager, her role is to plan all the courses and workshops and things that happen to encourage people to learn at the intersection of science, art, and design and technology. We have Vanessa Fleury, who is our development manager, and she's been working really hard to help us connect with new partners and help us kind of be more purposefully engaged in our sustainability efforts. We have Giovanni Lopez, who just started as our brand new lab manager. So he'll be managing all of our membership program, helping provide advice and support as artists get started working on their projects in the lab, as well as mentoring our young people. And of course, there's me. I'm the executive director, and I have a science background, but I've very quickly fallen in love with working with artists and the way that they have influenced my own scientific practice. GenSpace's programming falls into 4 major buckets. We have a membership program. So if you are an artist and are interested in working biology and biotech into your artistic practice, you can come and join the lab as a member, and you got 24/7 lab access and a little bit of mentorship to help you pursue your own creative projects. We also offer courses and workshops for the public. Anyone can come. You don't have to have a particular educational background or PhD to be able to participate in our programs. Again, they're really aimed at people with little or no scientific training, and they're on a really, really diverse range of topics and ideas around emerging technologies, biology, design, and technology. Again, Jasmine can speak a lot more to that. I'll tell you a few more stories in a minute. We also have some youth initiatives. We have an internship program for students from underrepresented backgrounds in STEM. And again, our program is pretty unique in the context of other STEM research internships, largely because of this interdisciplinary focus. The way that we weave art, design, history, culture into our programs is pretty special, I think, compared to other STEM internships. And again, it's largely due to the incredible talents of the artists in our community. And then finally, we have a series of outreach events, discussion groups. In fact, last night we were just talking, or 2 nights ago, excuse me, we were talking about carbon capture and microbes and plankton and the ways that those are involved in kind of potentially presenting some new opportunities for thinking about climate resilience. And artists are a critical part of those discussions. They bring a lens that we don't always hear when scientists talk to other scientists about these kinds of issues. And of course, we love to do hands-on partnerships and programs with partners. So I wanted to transition now to tell you just a few stories about things that happen at GenSpace to maybe bring some of this abstraction to life and talk a little bit more about the ways that artists, scientists, and learning happen here in our lab. So I'm first going to tell you about a few examples of courses and workshops that are either designed or taught by people working at the intersection of art and science and design. And so this is Danielle Trophy, who is a designer. She's coming from a kind of traditional industrial design background, but fell in love with biomaterials and biodesign. And then more recently with biomimicry as a conceptual framework for understanding how we can live more in tune with nature. So she teaches this incredible workshop called Biomimicry in the Field, where she teaches participants the basic principles of learning from nature and learning with nature, and then takes the participants out for a walk in Greenwood Cemetery, where they can practice observing and noticing the skills that nature brings and the wisdom that nature brings. And then they actually can take a little time to prototype an example of a design to encourage our world to live a little bit more resiliently with respect to things like climate change and water futures and ecological health. So these are some photos from Danielle's workshop. And again, in this workshop, there are architects, designers, engineers, and artists who are learning from Danielle and learning with Danielle, but also teaching. They teach each other in these kinds of workshops by sharing their own knowledge and expertise. So these are some kind of examples of the ways that we approach teaching and learning with the intersection of artists and designers. Here's another example from Chris Kennedy and Chloe Zimmerman. They ran a workshop called Fruiting Bodies, and the concept here was around micro-remediation. So this is the idea that you can have fungus that can help clean up an environment if there's been some sort of contamination or long-term environmental, excuse me, what's the word I'm looking for? If there's been pollution in the environment for a long time, you can use fungi to clean it up. And so they do this both from an artistic practice as well as from a scientific one. And so the project that they did, which was incredibly beautiful, I'm really, really, really amazed by this. They had people make molds of body parts. And so they created these little auger statues of their hands or their thumb, or they had baby doll parts, which was like particularly funny and weird, and I loved it. And they had this experience where they would grow fungi on these body parts. And then we went to a site near GenSpace that has a lot of kind of residual industrial mess that's kind of left over from when companies have moved out, and they did a kind of a burial ceremony where they put these body parts into the ground. So there was like a personal healing element, and there was a environmental healing element, and all kind of focused around this lens of how can we understand both the science and the spiritual around using or collaborating with nature to heal our environment. So this is one of my favorite projects that I've seen happen at the lab that really marries art and science really beautifully. And then, of course, we have an abundance of nature walks and ways in which ecologists and naturalists can share their knowledge of the living world with artists and designers, and kind of inspire that like love of nature, the ways that that artists and designers see the natural world in a way that scientists don't always see it. So encourage people to come and join us to see the nature in our neighborhoods, as well as learn more about the environment that we want to conserve and preserve as we face some of these global climate issues. So those are just some examples of workshops and ways in which we teach science, but teach it in a way that engages and pulls out the knowledge and expertise of artists and designers and people who are coming from creative practice to enrich the conversation and the potential of emerging biotech, and just having a little bit more of a connection with our natural world. And then, oh, sorry, this is the last workshop that I'll preview. And again, I don't want to say too much about this because Simone Johnson is going to be speaking this afternoon. So I just wanted to like promo her and really encourage you all to stay for her workshop. She and Megan Wang collaborated with a few other folks to put together this incredible series on art, science, and design collaborations for climate resiliency and water futures, where we had NYC H2O speak about the water in our neighborhoods. We had Works on Water, who led us through this incredible exercise of evoking thoughts and words and flavors of water in our conceptions. And it was just such a beautiful experience. So I really hope you all will go and connect with Simone this afternoon and hear what she has to say about ways that artists and scientists collaborate to make magic on the waterfront. So now I'm going to transition to a few examples of projects and things that people have made at GenSpace or have created or imagined here at the lab, and ways that, again, artists and designers and creatives can connect with each other and make magic happen to make new things. So the first example that I'll share is just a new company called Alginate. They are a group that works with seaweed fibers to make textiles, to make clothing. And so again, you should definitely check out their Instagram. It's really beautiful, really exciting work that they're doing to kind of engage the fashion industry and thinking about sustainability from a slightly different perspective. So these are some photos from their early days where they were taking seaweed material called alginate, and they can make it into a bio yarn and then produce these like beautiful little knit swatches. And somebody even knitted this like incredibly beautiful tank top, and they've been playing around with it in shoe design and sneakers. And this project really came out of the Biodesign Challenge, which again, for anybody who's not familiar, Dan Grushkin, who is one of the founders of GenSpace, also started the Biodesign Challenge, which is a design competition for mainly university students. And each year, a couple hundred young people come together and share their ideas for biodesign, using biodesign to solve the world's greatest challenges, whether that's climate resilience, new medicines. Sometimes they use it to probe and ask questions that are pretty provocative. So definitely encourage you all to check that out this coming spring. It's pretty amazing. There's also, again, a number of designers who work at the lab at the intersection of science, technology, and materials. And so this is Gal Yakubovich. She works with bioplastics. And again, she comes from a materials perspective and collaborated with a materials engineer here at the lab to design and develop some of the recipes that she uses to make bioplastic raincoats, wetsuits, and bags. And then the last thing that I'll share is, again, just to kind of reference the collaboration that we did with Common Frequencies with Elisa last night. this collaboration with Interspecifics, where we had our young people write science fiction stories. They participated in a learning workship where they talked a lot about non-human intelligence, and then they wrote these science fiction stories about hybrid creatures at the end of the world. So I think that kind of, to sum it up, really this is truly about collaboration and partnerships, and the ways that scientists, artists, designers, students, engineers, young people come together to make things and to imagine futures that otherwise don't come together. And I think that speaks to the kind of serendipity of bringing people together. So that's really all I want to say. I'm really grateful to be here with you all today, and I'm looking forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Beth. This is such a unique space and a unique project. I haven't taken a course there, but you'll be seeing me. It's really, really cool. And during the pandemic, I think a lot of people turn to the arts to, you know, to connect somehow with nature or with other people. I don't know. It's something I've been doing, so I think I'm ready to try it out. So next, I'm presenting Eve Andre Laramie. Eve is a professor of art at Pace University, where she's also a director of the Center for the Arts, Society, and Ecology. Her work and research explore the subtle historical and social dimensions between artistic practice and scientific inquiry, questioning commonly held assumptions about art and science, and how these views are transmitted over time. Her art has been exhibited through the US, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Eve has received grants from the Paula Krasner Foundation, fellowships from the New York Foundation for Arts, and grants from the Mid-Atlantic States Arts Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Warhol Foundation grant, among many others. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Welcome, Eve.
There, I think I'm unmuted.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really great to be here. And Beth, that was just fabulous hearing about everything that or some of the things you're doing at GenSpace. I really look forward to learning more about this incredible organization. I will be talking about the ways in which I have integrated ecological art and environmental art and brought together university students from the sciences with university art students in a couple of case studies at Pace University. So let me share my screen here. Is that it? Yes, okay. So yes, I'll be talking about these art and science collaborations. And the model that, that I use at Pace University is the learning community model. And learning communities traditionally link two courses together, whether those are two courses in the arts or whether they're two different disciplines. That's sort of the traditional model. And a group of friends of mine, colleagues, friends, got together for dinner one night, had a great dinner, great conversation, a couple bottles of wine. And we thought, why don't we do a super learning community? Why don't we bring together, you know, I was the artist, there's an anthropologist there, there is a political scientist there, and then the person who founded the Peace and Justice Studies department at Pace University. And it's like, wouldn't it be great to mash together all of these disciplines with a cohort of first semester freshman students and see what happens, you know, then we can trace them over the period of the 4 years of their education. So this was a high impact practice. It was interconnected, transdisciplinary, and we wanted to see what the outcomes were going to be at the end of this sort of test balloon model. So some of the research that we wanted students to engage in to kind of deepen their understanding of complex problems in the environment, dynamic systems, including climate change, to inspire their critical thinking, and really to bring undergraduate research in both the arts and the sciences to a different level. So what I brought to this mixture, this sort of educational laboratory, was a course called Environmental and Ecological Art in a Contemporary Context. And these are some of the outcomes that I was interested in students having. You know, how can we develop their field work? How can we, you know, enrich their understanding of how ecological systems are interconnected and how they work, and how can they express this poetically and visually? So these are the 4 courses that were linked together. That art course with peace and justice studies, things like the toxic remnants of war, political anthropology, and political science. And what our shared objectives were is to track these first-year students, see if it made a difference, and see whether they would become thought leaders, and how they would envision the future. So some of the goals were to develop the ability to work across media, to bring in issues of environmental justice, develop their skills, analytical thinking, sort of being developed at the same time as creative problem solving. Field work, we got out of the classroom a lot, and develop a sensitivity toward human impacts. So we started out with, you know, where are we here, right here and now? And Pace University is situated, it's right by City Hall. So there's 2 rivers on either side. That up near Chinatown, there is the old Collect Pond, which was the major water source for Lower Manhattan. We studied the local indigenous peoples, and then we broadened that to include the New Jersey waterfront and the Brooklyn waterfront. I live in Greenpoint, and I'm very familiar with that part of North Brooklyn waterfront. So we would, with the ferry, you know, we would be making a lot of field trips to the Brooklyn waterfront. And they do mapping projects, design projects, public performances. The students were from all different disciplines. They weren't just art students. So they were asked to work from their strengths. So we studied the biogeography, we studied the crypto creeks, the indigenous peoples. We talked about ways of regreening the Brooklyn waterfront, regreening the Lower Manhattan waterfront with sustainable design projects. They did visual campaigns to raise awareness, and civic engagement internships. So starting out looking at Lower Manhattan, then moving to the North Brooklyn waterfront, where we traced the historical streams, creeks, and springs, and looked at how the urban landscape or cityscape is like a palimpsest. So it's kind of like looking at the waterfront in terms of deep time. And we really focused on Newtown Creek and Bushwick Creek. There's also these smaller creeks up around Green Street and Freeman Street. And interestingly, during Hurricane Sandy, you know, all of this stuff is like covered with concrete now. But during Hurricane Sandy, you know, there were jets of water coming up from the cracks in the sidewalk because of the storm surge. So all of those hydraulic systems are still there underground. So tracing that, becoming more and more familiar. Early on in the semester, I take the students to the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant. Every time a toilet is flushed at Pace University, this is where the sewage goes. It goes to Greenpoint. And they were able to get an understanding of how systems of infrastructure and systems of, our resource use are interconnected. So this was just a group of students at one of these trips. So then I wanted students to engage their research with the urban cityscape, and all kinds of projects developed out of this. But this project, I found it really interesting that the student identified the fact that urban trees and urban plantings around the city, both in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, tend to become ashtrays, right? It's where people throw their trash. It's where people throw their cigarette butts. So Shona Nash is a student who did this, and she simply identified these plants and made this signage so that when people would sit there or stand around there, they would learn a little bit about this and possibly dispose of their trash elsewhere. So these signs were placed in urban planters around the city. Then I have them do these visual campaigns. And I'm just trying to look at my screen a little differently here. There we go. So I teach them basic Photoshop skills. And they do a poster campaign. They then post this on social media, and they get dialogues going among their peers. We started doing this sort of thing shortly after Fukushima happened in Japan. And we then studied the Indian Point nuclear reactor, which is, now going to be shut down, decommissioned, but was still very, very active for those years following the 2011 Fukushima disaster. So some of the students identified the problem of nuclear waste and the impact on our water resources. Another one of these student visual campaign, this one about global warming, sort of using the trope of Salvador Dali and the melting clock, we're running out of time. Raising coastlines in relation to the climate crisis. And actually, interestingly, a number of students identified desertification as a really important climate change issue. So this is Central Park as though it were desertified. And another one of these visual campaigns. Then we came over to Transmitter Park on the Greenpoint waterfront. There was an abandoned building there. And I asked that students come up with a repurposing plan for this building that raised awareness to waterfront issues and brought something to the community. And so this is a, sort of a overview of what Transmitter Park looks like from the air. And that building that you see there is an abandoned radio station, that's why it's called Transmitter Park. So I gave everybody a hypothetical $1 million. I said, you've got $1 million budget, you can do whatever you want. I want you to think really, really big. And so some students didn't think really big. Some students, like this student said, well, let's tear down the building and build a gazebo. And it's like, well, you've got $1 million. What else can you do? So they came up with this wild project of this solar electromagnetic powered kinetic sculpture. Who knows whether this would work or not, but it got the student to think big. And this was a model from that, a three-dimensional model that the student made. Another project that was developed by a student, Stephanie Gonzalez, was to turn this little building into a museum that not only spoke to the community about the history of the site itself, but also how do we build sustainable waterfronts. The museum also included a little tiny sort of pocket cafe and a compost garden, so where community people could bring their compost. And so there would be displays of the early history, again, going back to the indigenous peoples, models for accessible and sustainable waterfronts, and a scale model of the park itself, along with the cafe and a compost garden. And then another student came up with an education program that, this is a student who said like 2 words during the whole semester, you know, and then she came up with this brilliant, brilliant model for an education program for the park called We Planted. And again, it was to raise awareness of the history of the park, but also brought courses to people in terms of cultivating plants. And I don't know, this is actually a video that she made, little, yeah, it's not, oh, there it goes. Is it, do you see it moving? Moved a little bit. Okay, so she came up with this kind of an architectural model for it, along with a curriculum model. And so there's also a seed bed where plants could get started. Community members could then take those baby plants away into their own gardens or front yards or whatever. And then there was a projection room that she envisioned, and so those are her models. And after doing a series of these super learning communities, I got together with a couple of colleagues in biology, a soil scientist and an ecologist. And we decided to bring a group of students down to Costa Rica, to the Costa Rica rainforest, to teach art and science collaboratively in the rainforest. And there was a little lab there that at the place where we stayed, which was kind of a, you know, an ecotourism / scientific laboratory. And we linked 3 courses together and spent a month there. In terms of the student art projects, we did a lot of photography. We did night photography, sound recordings, we did paintings, video, drone photography, and then we did an exhibition in New York City after that. And the students, the science students and the art students did these collaborative research papers. So on site, students collected soil samples that they then extracted the DNA from to see the difference in the organisms that lived in the primary rainforest and the secondary rainforest, which is a much younger rainforest. Every time a hurricane comes through there, you know, everything in the rainforest changes. So they were able to kind of track those changes by looking at the organisms in the soils. So this helped, you know, found some other initiatives at Pace University, and the students and I formed what we call the Dirt Collective. It was just a group of students who were interested in bringing together art and science. And an example of one of our night photography projects. This was the first time that a lot of these students had ever seen the Milky Way, you know, so it was just astonishing to them. This is an example of one of a video still from the drone photography, where we were able to envision through these videos, you know, the track and the path of hurricanes, and how the canopy, the rainforest canopy, actually different. And then also the role of both sustainable agriculture there nearby and unsustainable agriculture, where the rainforest is just kind of cleared so that pineapples can be grown or whatever. So this was us in our little laboratory art studio one evening for a discussion. And students learned how to plot and, and as I said, take soil samples. And then we had this wonderful exhibition. Oh, yes, and we did this stop motion. One of the questions that Gracie had is, when you're looking at really serious things like climate change and species extinction, how do you stop from getting depressed? What do you do? And sometimes I think bringing humor into the mix is a remarkable thing. So while we were there over the period of this month, there was a point where we kind of hit, we were so mosquito bitten and there were bats in our rooms and snakes and poisonous dart frogs and bullet ants that it's like, come on, we need some levity. So we decided to do this very low-tech stop motion black and white film that looked like a home movie from the 1950s. We called it Hotel Bungalow Jungalo. And it was about sort of naive tourists in the rainforest, which were really us to a certain degree. The biologists were much more familiar with working in the field like that. And we just had a blast doing it. It was so much fun. It was equally as educational, and it provided a kind of levity. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Eve.
Thank you.
Your work is fascinating. It's an amazing combination of art and science, and the fact that the students get to actually use science tools in their work and then apply them to art and do it in the field is just must be such a pleasure for them. It's super interesting. I have questions, but I'm going to leave them for later because now I would like to present Issa Del Bello. Issa Del Bello came to New York City with a background in elementary education to pursue a master's degree at Teachers College, Columbia University. Shortly after she began teaching with with Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy as an environmental educator, introducing numerous students to urban ecology and wild spaces found within and around the park. Currently, she leads the education team at Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy as Director of Education. Her areas of specialty include place-based learning, differentiated instruction, curriculum development, educational psychology, and environmental education. She holds a master's in developmental psychology with a concentration in risk, resilience, and prevention, and a BA in elementary education with a dual concentration in science and literacy. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Very happy to be here. Eve, thank you for a wonderful presentation to follow. I'm not sure if I want your job or if I want to be one of your students, because the work that you do sounds amazing. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about Brooklyn Bridge Park as a whole, give a little bit of background of that, and then go into the work that we do within the education program. So for those of you who are not familiar with Brooklyn Bridge Park, it is a waterfront park built on repurposed industrial shipping piers. It is flanked by the East River. It is 1.8 miles in length and 85 acres. It goes underneath both the Brooklyn and Manhattan Bridge and has the vista of the Manhattan skyline. And one of the very unique aspects of the park is the fact that we do have an incredible amount of access to the waterfront. which has very much informed our educational programming. Hold on one second. Okay, so this is an image of the park space, or what was before the park space, piers. These are known as the finger piers, and were in use up until 1957 when they were deconstructed, and the larger piers that you see today. My slides are kind of slow. Graciela, are you seeing also a lag in slides? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm not sure why it's going slow. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second and then reload. Perhaps that will help. Okay, so here we are at the finger piers. And those were deconstructed, reconstructed in the 1950s. And the main reason why they did this is to accommodate for larger ships that were evolving within trade. By the 1970s, however, these piers were rendered obsolete because containerization occurred and most shipping was then sent to New Jersey. So we had these industrial shipping piers that were largely underutilized, some of which became derelict, and community members in the surrounding area galvanized and petitioned to have this space become a park and community space. So this is a, a plan of the park in its completion right now. Brooklyn Bridge Park is 95% complete. Only a couple parcels of land remain. And through this work, there were many iterations of what the community envisioned and what they wanted. And there was a lot of conversation of what the park design actually would be. And after all of that sort of community collaboration and work with architects, we do have this incredible green space that is Brooklyn Bridge Park. A major component of the park design-wise is not simply the human use and human benefits, but also ecological benefits. So softening all of those hard edges that were along the water, building salt marshes, building and fostering different types of habitat that can be found naturally in New York. Many of the plantings in the park are native, with the percentages, I believe 75% native plantings, to encourage habitat growth and native species to have a home themselves. So not a park that is simply designed for human use. I've been working at the park since 2011, and the amount that the habitat, that the ecosystem has grown is incredible. Every single year and in larger numbers, we're finding more and more species that have really made this their home. And it's really a magical thing to observe. Our education program, the major goal of the program is to engender a connection to natural spaces that are in and around New York City. There is a general tendency for, I think, many New Yorkers to think of nature as something that is very separate from their cityscape and their urban existence, when in fact they are surrounded by nature. You know, that they're also in an archipelago surrounded by water and a water habitat. And so that's something that we really tried to bring to light and foster that connection, not just the knowledge that nature exists, but also the wonder and discovery that comes along with that, where attachments are formed. This is an image from one of our oyster classes. We have several oyster gardens in the park in partnership with Billion Oyster Project, and have a big piece of exploration of what those habitats look like. Our programs, we offered sort of 3 different components. So we have our school programs, our public programs, and our professional development. By and large, the breadth of who we serve is our school programs and our public programs. So looking at our school programs, we have a conceptual frame that is in 3 buckets. So one is history. We look at both the human history, so that is infrastructure, engineering, and design of the Brooklyn Waterfront. So we have a class that is based all on the Brooklyn Bridge, but we also look at the ecological history of Brooklyn Bridge Park and surrounding area. And particularly thinking of our waterways, you know, we hearken to the fact that the East River, although it is rather abundant now in terms of biodiversity and abundance, historically speaking, what is documented is something wildly unimaginable. You know, the sort of adage that you would be able to cross the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan on the backs of sturgeons. Just this utopian ecosystem that we really can only imagine at this point. Another piece that we look at is ecology. So history, ecological history, ecology itself. So we look at the terrestrial history of, you know, Brooklyn Bridge Park itself, the riparian area, and then by and large, the ecology of the East River, New York Harbor, Hudson River estuary. And then the final piece that we look at is sustainable design and sustainable infrastructure. So as I sort of mentioned, Brooklyn Bridge Park was very, very intentionally designed. It is known to be a sustainably designed park with several different elements within the park. We have a water catchment system that re-irrigates rainwater back into the park. We utilize green roofs where we can, absorption points as much as we can, with the understanding that as climate change continues to occur, so will precipitation in patterns that were unforeseen before. And so we have a class where we bring students into our education center. This image is of students gathered around our discovery station, which I will talk about in a moment, but really having a clear understanding of what the footprint and design is of the park and what those design elements are, with the understanding that we do have a changing environment and that we do have to be responsible as humans in our behavior, and that design actually does impact and inform behavior. And so we sort of look at what the landscape architects did. This is Michael Van Volkenberg and Associates. This is their final rendering of what the park will look like when it's complete, mostly complete. And then this is some of the activities that the students do for this class. So a big piece that we do, that we look at, is sort of water runoff absorption in thinking of, you know, major flood events. Of course, we talk about Sandy, and also just what happens when it rains in New York City. And then we have students design their own ideal park space. This is generally in partnership. These are a couple little knuckleheads that we're having a great time presenting. And then here it's somewhat legible, but I like this piece because there are a lot of sustainable components that are listed. So grass with sponges. So the idea that green space does actually absorb, right? The idea that salt marshes are incredibly important for any sort of cityscapes when it comes to storm. Having permeable ground cover, and also having native plantings, which is massively important. So our classes, we serve kinder through 12th grade. And these classes take place in the park, utilizing the park space as our classroom. In a normal year, they also take place in our Environmental Education Center, which opened in 2015. That is a much more grainy picture than I had anticipated. So this is an image of the space itself while it is not being used. For the space, in designing it and opening in 2015, we wanted it to be a reflection of the education program itself as a whole, which that program is a reflection of all of the hidden stories that you really can find in and around Brooklyn Bridge Park. And one opportunity that we had was to create a space that wasn't just reaching the learners that we had before, sort of those school-aged children and teens, but also families and adults as well. And so one of the things that we did in sort of curating and designing this space is create content that will reach learners and connect with learners at all levels. And with that, we have public open hours, again, in a normal year, 4 days a week. A major goal of our work is accessibility. And so having free public open hours is a major piece of our work. And so we have our permanent exhibits in the space, and then we also have monthly themes that have interactive exhibits, activities that change month. And again, these are all based on history, ecology, and sustainability. This is an image from our pollination theme where we have some dramatic play where siblings are acting as beekeepers. We also have animal feedings as part of our open hours activities. A big piece, again, that we really shoot for is making those connections to the natural world. And of course, you know, there's a lot of empathy building and connection making in directly and humanely meeting and learning about these animals. And so the other pieces that we have, you know, we have themed art and craft, games, and multiple interactive exhibits. I recommend that you come and visit us once we are open again, and we are hoping for the fall. Another piece that we have in the Education Center is our East River Aquarium. It is 500 gallons. And if you can see in this picture, this little girl is looking at a black sea bass. I'm not sure if you're able to see the fish in the tank. And that also has a touch tank. And so there is, again, that interactive piece. The design of this exhibit, and I'm going to talk more about sort of the collaborative process of creating this space, but the design of this had multiple iterations. And so it really did take a long time to arrive at what the actual tank looks like today. So I want to shift a little bit here in thinking about sort of art and creativity and looking at the environment and climate from not the lens of the viewer, but as the practitioner and as the educator. Because for those of you who do have experience as educators, as many of us do on this panel, it's a creative process. It is an artistic process, and it's something that is sort of never finished, right? And so in these works, we had a massive amount of collaboration and also difficulty in completing them because we had so much that we wanted to fit in. So this is a beginning conceptual piece for a discovery station that we have in our education center. You can see sort of all of the different squares of conceptual pieces that we wanted to include. This is the final product of our discovery station. And we made this in partnership with Human Nature Projects, as well as Moe Inc. Human Nature did the majority of the design, and Moe Inc. did all of the fabrication and some of the design. So the discovery station itself has a 3-dimensional map of Brooklyn Bridge Park, and thinking of iterations of developing educational interactive tools. One of the things that we talked about was actually having the water of this as a touch tank instead of having a touch tank on our major tank. That was not something that logistically worked, but there were a lot of ideas that we sort of sifted through to arrive where we are today. So the Discovery Station has different pieces. There are static pieces like the top, but then there are also modular pieces that are, you know, very touch-based learning, where each drawer has a separate concept that you can interact with. This is our mock oyster monitoring drawer. And we have 2 young men who are acting as young environmental stewards and doing that. This is another drawer where you have a pullout. This is a cross section of one of the cables on the Brooklyn Bridge. It is not to scale, it's much smaller, but you know, elucidating all of these unseen concepts and unseen ideas was a major point for us in the education space. This is another example of one of our interactive drawers, and something that we really found was we were thinking that it was for younger kids, but found that in actuality, it was something that was far more appropriate for adults, just because it is so challenging. And there's this intersection where you have adults where it's at their sort of proximal zone, and younger ones that just use the blocks to play, which is also fine. And here, this is sort of the last image that we have of our Discovery Station. This is a little one using a viewfinder, where we have images of birds that have been taken in Brooklyn Bridge Park. And a really interesting thing about this, it's a very fun drawer, and once kids understand how to use viewfinders, they enjoy it very much. But it's a very generational piece where a lot of the little ones have no idea what to do with these. Okay, so I want to shift to another work that was created before my time with the Conservancy, but it's something that I have been using as a teaching tool, and our education team has been using as a teaching tool for years. So this is a piece by an artist. Her name is Nim Lee. She is also a marine biologist and was an educator for many years with Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy. And thinking about, you know, sort of the artistic process and how that intersects with being an educator, there are many components with that. And looking at sort of her process and a final product, I recently came upon her initial sketches of what this poster were to be, and sort of what the organisms would be included, and sort of how to frame them. And so this was a very happy find for me, simply because I've been looking at this poster for so many years and admiring it for so many years. But this is something that we have distributed all throughout Brooklyn. It's a free poster that we've been passing out for about a decade. And, you know, there are many people who have this in their homes, their offices, and their classrooms. And we have come up with a second one. We've created a second one in partnership, again, with the same artist. And this was an interesting process, and thinking of sort of creating artistic and educational works as a collaborative piece, because I was actually here for this, and there are far more people now around the park, invested in the park, than there were a decade ago. The staff is larger, the usership is larger, and the habitat has grown tremendously. And so in creating this piece, there was a lot of conversation with, you know, our education team, as well as our horticulture team and other folks that are close to our work. And this was actually a fun challenge in finding all of the different organisms that we wanted to include. We had this whole spreadsheet, and there was sort of competition in what we could include and what we could not include, or what we should not include, what should be featured. A big piece of creating this watercolor painting was thinking of relationships, right? And all of the relationships that you have within ecosystems and within habitats, and how to feature those in sort of a harmonious way where it makes sense with the composition. There's definitely an amount of artistic license. You will not find all of these items in the park, all of these living things in the park at the same time. You have migration patterns, you have flowering patterns, and so forth. So, and I have a couple sketches that I wanted to share of just different iterations. One of the things that we really wanted to share in the bottom right corner, if you will notice, there are some very cute looking opossums. And that is one of the new-ish residents to Brooklyn Bridge Park. And they're a very important organism for an ecosystem. And so one of our goals is to depict them as these lovable creatures, as opposed to reviled or feared, because they do have certain angles where they look very cute, but they also have certain angles where they do not, right? And so, making sure that we tell those stories, making sure that we are developing those through lines of making connections and experiencing empathy and relating to things that are outside of yourself and perhaps outside of your comfort zone. And so this was the final product that we landed on. And so that's the basic overview of the program. A couple things that I did want to sort of touch upon in sort of thinking about all of this is the idea of science communication, right? And the idea of how to affect change. A big piece of the work that we do as educators is we act as shepherds and liaisons, right? In thinking of the conversation, the roundtable conversation that happened last night, there was a gentleman who is a scientist, and one of the things that he says, which I sort of take umbrage with, is that scientists are not good communicators. I am not a scientist by trade, so I truly can't speak to that. But that brings in the idea of what role does art have in that, right? And what does that have to do with education? And I think as an educator, the most important thing is that you are communicating, and you do so in any modality or any discipline that you can, or utilize many within your toolkit. And I think art is such an important piece of that, and it's such an important tool. And as I've been thinking about sort of what to talk about for this panel discussion, there's a phrase that has just kind of been coming back to me. So I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a very big art town. And when I was growing up, there was this bumper sticker that was pretty ubiquitous that just said, "The arts are not a luxury." And, as a young person, I'd never really thought about sort of what the implications of that are. And, arts are incredibly powerful. They are emotive. They will motivate. They can cause people to act. They cause people to feel. Feeling causes action, right? And so there is such a lovely opportunity, an important opportunity in, not looking at science and art as mutually exclusive, but as two things that should continue to intersect, right? And also understanding that there is such an important sort of dovetail in that situation. And so I want to sort of close my talk with, so I looked up, where did the arts are not a luxury come from? Did just some kooky person in Santa Fe come up with this, or did it have an origin? And I came upon a speech that was written by Robert Attenborough, which is simply that. So I'm going to read a couple sentences and then we can go into the Q&A. But I think it's very important to sort of the work in environmental activism and, understanding that the arts are incredibly powerful, how those two things interact. So the arts not only enrich our lives, but also grant us the opportunity to challenge accepted practices and assumptions. They give us a means to protest against that which we believe to be unjust, a voice to condemn the brute and the bully, a brief to advocate the cause of human dignity and self-respect, a rich and varied language through which we can express our national identity. The national identity part, I think it was a specific speech, but the general idea, I think, is very important. So that is all I have for the presentation part.
Thank you very much, Issa. That was amazing. It's amazing to have that access to nature in New York City, and the center is great. I've been there with my students, and it's really great. It's very surprising what you can find underwater. And anyway, I think we can move on to the Q&A. I think that Beth had to leave, so I'm going to introduce Jasmine Allen, who's going to be participating in the Q&A. Jasmine is also at GenSpace. She's the education manager, and she has taught, learned, and participated in ecology and evolutionary biology research at CUNY, SUNY, the American Museum of Natural History, and Queens Botanical Garden. Her graduate research is focused on integrated pest management and intersection of agriculture and entomology. And she shares her love of science by teaching and by thinking about how to increase accessibility and create inclusive spaces for learning in science education. So welcome, Jasmine. And now, well, I'd like to explore, there are a few questions already in the Q&A. I think there are also some questions in the chat. I'm going to try to go to them, or maybe somebody can integrate them, help me integrate them into the Q&A. But I'd like to explore your opinion, you panelists, on your roles as educators and artists in explaining and raising awareness about climate change, which I think it's better described as climate crisis. You are all involved, very involved in this. And yesterday there was an interesting discussion about whether there is a role that's kind of a mandatory role during this crisis to get involved and promote this communication and this understanding and perhaps, you know, taking action. So let's see. I don't know. Let me see. I think that Eve had to leave too. So there is a question. There is a question for Eve here. Bear with me. Well, one question I had for Eve, and that she kind of mentioned, but maybe Issa, you can answer this question too. Artists and educators interested in environmental issues often create work and raise awareness about the dangers of climate change. So sometimes those things that especially kids, I guess, learn can be very surprising, and sometimes they can lead to a sense of hopelessness, or sometimes they can make them just want to take action and do something and change for the better. So how do you manage that? How do you deliver that information so it's not something too dark, but actually makes them want to go and fix the problems and save the world?
So I think that there's an importance in sort of how you curate or present information. I think that it's incredibly important to be realistic and honest in the facts that you present. And in thinking of climate change, it's pretty terrifying, right? It's pretty dire. And you see a lot of fatigue when it comes to looking at the climate crisis, looking at climate change, because it is terrifying, right? And I think a big piece of that is really how you frame it, right? Like, are we completely past a point of no return? I don't believe so. At a point where action is critical, I do believe that. And so in presenting how dire the facts actually are is incredibly important, but also providing opportunities for students to encounter solutions or to empower them to be part of the solution or to come up with creative solutions on their own is incredibly important, right? You don't, I mean, I think as adults, we don't have those shepherds, right? We interpret information as it comes. But as a role as an educator, I think is, providing that honest information, but also the tools to accept and also act, which is key, I would say.
Thank you. This is a question for Jasmine. I think that Beth mentioned that many of the people who attend GenSpace are artists who want to incorporate science into their work. Is this something new, or this is something that has happened at GenSpace since the beginning? And my question was also if that interaction with those artists has changed the way you teach science as a scientist. How did that interaction with the artists affect your way of teaching?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I've been at GenSpace since September, and Beth has been there for much longer than I have. But I believe that art has been a part of GenSpace from the start. We have, if you check out our website on our classes page, you'll see programs like sculpting with mycelium, how to make kombucha, how to make paper from kombucha, how to make like mycelium bricks or art just from like pieces of fungus. So there are all these workshops that are integrating both science and art. And I think it goes back to what you all were saying earlier about like giving that power back to our participants to work towards climate change solutions, right? So if all we're talking about is doom and gloom, then it kind of leaves us feeling a little desolate. But if we're giving actual solutions and looking towards artists and like what people are coming up with today, I think it helps people, learn about what's going on, learn about both like the science and art aspects of these solutions, and to help them feel empowered to do this from their own homes. So you probably figure that most of our programs in the past year or so have been online, and most people think of science as something that you have to go into a lab and do, but we've been sending supplies over to people's homes or giving them websites where they've already like come up with these kits where you can like grow your own bacteria at home or grow mycelium so that you can create these art pieces at home. And so people start to feel like this is something that you can do on your own and work on from home without having to be a part of this like big academic institution or like having to be a part of the industry or something. And as for the way that we work with artists and scientists and people from all different disciplines in our classes, we really try to have our participants come together and teach each other. We're not into lecturing. We don't really have our instructors. We're not into having our instructors be the only expert in the room, because we know that some expertise lies with every single participant in our classes. For example, I see a few familiar faces in the audience who have been a part of so many of our classes, and some of them are artists, some of them are scientists, some of them are neither, some teachers, some high school students, and everybody has their own bit to offer, which I think is the most valuable part about being at GenSpace.
Great. I'm looking at a new question here. How can you interweave the climate crisis into your existing activities at GenSpace and at the Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy? So you do a lot about environmental issues, and I see that a lot of the projects are people trying to bring solutions and it's amazing that you must feel really empowered when it's something you can do at a small scale, but at your home. But how do you do it with this broader sense, with the climate crisis in general? Jasmine, sorry.
Yeah, so a lot of these programs are either public facing, or we think about age groups, so some are targeted specifically for teens versus adults. And they're largely discussion based. So like I said earlier, we don't really encourage lecturing, but for everybody to really be a part of these discussions. For example, we have our free monthly program called Planet Microbes, where our instructor, Kyle Frischkorn, sends out a very scientific, like jargony piece of literature for people to read, but we know that that's not always accessible to everyone. So along with that, he'll send out a PopSci article. And if that even is inaccessible for people, he presents the information in a way that's more easy to digest when we come together to meet before we go out and break out into those discussion groups. And then in our other classes and workshops, we really encourage hands-on participation. So things that we can work with, whether that's making something physically or doing something, learning a piece of bioinformatics skill that you can do from home. That's what scientists really are doing in their labs, learning to analyze that data and really understanding that it doesn't just have to be scientists in these big institutions that that are limited to doing this type of work.
And so the question was also for Issa. How do you do it at the Conservancy? I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but how central is are the climate issues to the learning at the center?
So I will say we don't have a specific class that is dedicated to climate change or the climate crisis, but it is a through line in a lot of the discussions that we have. I think because, there is the idea that it's, at least in my mind, omnipresent, right? And it is part of a discussion of many aspects and looking at any sort of ecological space, and in thinking of conservation and stewardship, it's always a specter that is there. And I think, in listening to Jasmine, a big piece that, a big theme that I hear you touching upon is the idea of accessibility, right? And the concept of, the fact that science in a lot of ways can be daunting and intimidating and perceived as, and perceived thusly making it unapproachable. Shifting the experience with science in general from science with a capital S to a lowercase, where you can be sort of armchair informed and also active in the choices you make and also the actions that you take, right? Looking at sort of the content that we address at the park, I think our sustainable landscape class is the biggest one, specifically because it gets our students to think about the fact that weather patterns are changing, that sea levels are rising, and in human response to that, what sort of infrastructural design elements should we be considering, right? Not simply how do we build spaces to cope with the changes that are definitely occurring on this earth, but also how do we build spaces that determine behavior, right? That determine what a carbon footprint is, or how people actually move or use objects, or, are influenced to use less. So I think that's the main piece. Another area that, I think it's just a constant through line is all of our water-based classes looking at those ecosystems, examining their value, right? Not just the novelty and sort of that human connection that you can make to the natural world, but also the importance of ecosystem services that they provide, right? So one of the design components of Brooklyn Bridge Park that we talk about in our classes are the salt marshes that are artificial salt marshes that have been, put back into a land where we used to be entirely surrounded by salt marshes, right? And the ecosystem service that they provide is sort of as a sponge, right? And so when we do have massive storm events, we right now don't have a lot of those ecosystem services that, were there within the natural world until we sort of moved that all out. So examining a lot of sort of human design, human behavior, and importance of protecting habitat is our answer to that at this point. Again, we're an ever-evolving program, and so I'm sure there will be more to come.
Yeah, and also what you provide is this knowledge of what's there, that invisible life that's underwater and in the park. And I was thinking that just by knowing what's there and also knowing the historic component, knowing that this place was different and it functioned so much better before. So then you can look for solutions and try to go back to that. You don't have to create something completely new. You just have to try to restore. And another question I had for you is that young kids often have a very emotional connection with nature, with animals that are cute or with animals that are scary or whatever piece of nature they are presented with. So do you see a difference in that reaction with as kids, as you work with older kids, teens and adults? Is that something that we lose? And yes, and I think it's something important to try to keep, because that's what the role of art is in all this, right? To reach our emotions and make us to want to get involved.
So I think that a big component that we really try to incorporate is the concept of play. And I think, play is a big piece of learning. It's also a big piece in the creative process. And you do see behavioral differences and reticence, like the presence of reticence among teenagers and adults in comparison to younger ones is pretty stark. And one of the things that, and maybe this will change in, 20 years, a lot of the adults that we encounter are just amazed and surprised and dumbfounded by the fact that we find so many living things in the East River. A lot of native New Yorkers grew up thinking that it was this toxic wasteland that you don't touch because it's going to burn your skin. And if you pull up a fish, it's going to have 3 eyes. And so you have these adults that have that preconceived notion, but kids are totally natural with this new knowledge and not surprised and not uncomfortable by it. And I think a big piece of, engaging adults and engaging teenagers is there's a big piece of trust there, right? Because if you feel like you're in a safe space, if you feel like you're comfortable, you're learning science with a lowercase s, you're going to be far more open to new experiences because the novelty becomes less scary. It becomes less intimidating. And so, I think formal science is, of course, incredibly important, but making it informal, because that makes it approachable, is a big piece in bringing in those audiences that would ordinarily be closed off to that newness.
Okay. And I have a question that might have been for Eve, but I think that Jasmine can also answer it. Is if you follow up with the participants to see how they apply what they learned at GenSpace. Is it something they bring their projects and then they might continue with them? Are you still in contact with the participants?
Yeah, so that's actually been one of the really wonderful things about being online. We've had classes, for example, how to grow your own dye using algae, sculpting with mycelium, and a number of other bio art and bio design workshops where we're creating these materials or like working on our projects all at the same time in the same Zoom room, but then we're following up with each other either by email or on social media, and especially Instagram in the following weeks. So I see that we have Alison Dell in in the audience here. She's been one of our participants for a while now, and it's just really nice to see people like her and other artists or scientists in our community just always posting based on what skills they've picked up, or like little bits and pieces of projects that they're co-creating and following up with on social media. And they post really beautiful pictures, and it's really nice to be tagged in it and see them really build off of each other and just like stemming from these workshops. So yeah, we do follow up, and it's been really nice. Some of them go on to become our instructors, or volunteer with GenSpace, or become our partners. So it's always this collaborative community that we try to, oh, hi, I see her in the chat, that we try to cultivate at GenSpace.
Okay, thank you. And I think we're running out of time, right, Richard?
So, thank you. GenSpace seems to have a lot of fans out there amongst our audience today. So usually I want to, so let me thank our panelists, Issa and Jasmine and Beth and Eve, who had to leave. Let's thank also Graciela for her moderating this and going through the questions when people aren't asking enough questions, and this stuff was so interesting that we saw and that we heard. Usually at this point in a conference, I would tell everyone to go upstairs at City Tech, where we have our conferences, and get some coffee and some chocolate chip cookies. But unfortunately, we can't offer those to you, but perhaps you have some in your own kitchen. At any rate, we're going to take a 10-minute break while we do our switching and get our second session of the day set up. So please, audience, stay with us, and we'll be back in 10 minutes at 10:45 to, excuse me, for the second session of the morning. Again, thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, Graciela, and we will see you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi. Oh, start my video. Okay. Am I in the right panel?
You
link?
are where you should be.
Okay, good. Let me try to. Oh, it says I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Okay. Celia will.
Oh, okay, start my video. Okay, got it. All right.
Okay. Right now we are live, and so we'll just get set. I mean, we have a break, but we did not exit the webinar. So we could just make sure everyone gets set. If you have a screen to share, you might just want to try that. Let's see if we can do that.
Sure, I'll pull down my screen share.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. If you'd
Hello.
like to test out your screen share quickly, you can do so now. Maybe we'll just start with Catherine, because you got on here first. Does that sound good? Are you doing any slides at the beginning? I'm
It's
not sure.
I was actually not planning to
Okay.
share my screen.
Okay, great. Just wanted to double check. And Simone, we got your slides, but if you want to try sharing them now, that'd be great.
Let me get off this screen.
Okay, good.
And then here, presentation. I forgot if I can work. Okay, we can stop share. I also wanted to say I have like a little curse word in one of my. It's because I took a picture of an Instagram post, but it was like too late to ask you about it. Just wanted to let you know.
So we'll have to give a,
Like a
what is that
disclaimer.
called? Some kind of alert?
A disclaimer. Yeah.
A
Sorry. It's a.
Okay, we're still waiting for Annalise.
If everyone could just say your name. I just want to make sure I don't mispronounce anyone's name when I do the bios.
I am Yulia Parshina-Kotas. Sorry about that. it's a tricky one, but Yulia is like Julia, but yeah. And
It was the last name. I just wanted to make sure.
Parshina-Kotas. Sorry. It's like every letter of the alphabet.
And mine is Simone Johnson.
Then I'm Catherine Gressel. Some people pronounce it Gressel, but it is Gressel. So I think you know that, but just to make sure.
And I know that, so that's important because I'm introducing you. We have one more artist to get on.
Should I do you mind if I try screen sharing just to make sure everything's working?
Sure.
Sure, okay. Let's see. Share. See, I'm glad I tried. Apparently, I need to give permissions. Okay, cool. I'm gonna have to log off for 1 second in order for permissions to kick in. Sorry, I'll be right back.
Okay. This is why we have the break to make sure, get everything. We have one artist who is in the audience. We have to get her to be a participant.
I'm back. Okay, let me try
Okay,
one more
hello.
time. Yeah, so between the last time we spoke and now, I have switched my workstation. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yay. I'm glad I did this. Otherwise,
Good.
it would have been a bad beginning.
Hi, Annalise. I think we're getting some problem with you're listed as an attendee, and we've got to get you as a participant. Great, you have arrived. So,
Do you mind just saying your name? I just want to make sure I pronounce it totally correctly.
Annalisa Jensen.
Annalisa, that's what I thought.
Yes.
okay, I think we'll proceed. So, hello, welcome back. And we are now about to begin session 2 of our work. We had learning at the intersection. That was quite an interesting panel for those of you who were with us through that. And this idea of art and science at an intersection of addressing climate crisis, it really, really is important. And we're seeing that from all different sides, from last night to this morning, and we're going to continue. And now we're going to be privileged to hear some working artists who are working at the intersection. And the moderator is Catherine Gressel, who's a contemporary curator at the Old Stone House in Washington Park. She's also an artist and writer focused on site-specific art. She earned her BA in art from Yale University and MA in arts administration from Columbia University. Catherine's previous exhibits dealing with such topics as income inequality, urban agriculture, and parks have been recognized by the New York Times, Time Out New York, Hyperallergic, News 12 Brooklyn. And in addition to organizing 12 major exhibitions to date at the Old Stone House, she has curated for Figment, No Longer Empty, my alma mater, St. Francis College, and the Brooklyn Historical Society, and was named the 2016 NARS Foundation Emerging Curator. She's selected for the 2015 Independent Curators International Curatorial Intensive in New Orleans. She has written and published on public and community art issues for Create Equity, Americans for Art, Public Art Dialogue, among others. And she's also served as program manager at Macmillan Gallery from 2010 to 2014, and has worked and consulted for diverse nonprofits, and is someone who is well qualified to introduce artists, to ask them questions, and to guide their discussion. So welcome, Catherine, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here and for having me. And I'm really excited to hear from these 3 artists, because I think they all have unique approaches to incorporating scientific inquiry and technology and collaboration in their work. First, I'll just kind of introduce the topic with some general observations that I've made as a curator, working with many of these artists engaging with these kinds of issues in their work, including Annalisa Jensen in a show called Brooklyn Utopias that we did together last summer, which I'm sure she'll allude to in her presentation. But there was a quote that really struck me, actually, from the Climate Change Guide for Young People that Julia illustrated in the New York Times, called Bad Future, Better Future, written by Julia Rosen. And the text states, "The biggest challenges we face are not about science, they're about people." And I think that this quote sort of helps show why a collaboration between scientists and artists becomes really important, and the importance of artists working in this space, because I'd like to think that art can kind of reach harder to reach people in unique ways, as well as even potentially shape policy decisions and things like that. And artists are, of course, traditionally creative problem solvers that experiment with different methodologies and technologies. And I've encountered many in my work who, like Julia herself, or the artists in the Common Frequencies show at BioBat, are pioneering new methods of collecting and presenting data, or even new methods of things like sustainable food production or soil remediation, as in the work of artists like Mary Mattingly or John Moon, who is an artist in my Brooklyn Utopia show doing a soil remediation project in Newtown Creek. But artists are also typically skilled designers and storytellers, as many previous panelists have pointed out, so they can really help communicate a message about climate change effectively and imagine alternatives, even if they're kind of more science fiction-y, imaginative alternatives. I think that's also really valuable, and we'll kind of see those things in the work of all the artists presenting today. And I think the artists on this panel are also finding ways to make participation in climate actions more accessible, especially for harder to reach populations, and at a time when, you know, there is a kind of a pretty big distrust of, you know, quote unquote science, and inequities that make climate change action feel sort of inaccessible for some, or not as relevant to their lives. So we'll definitely, I think, touch upon some issues of equity and diversity in this field. And before turning it over to panelists, I also want to mention just the importance of empathy in artists' work, and that's kind of a powerful tool that they have, because I think, as many people in this conference have pointed out, one of the biggest challenges is when the science that we're presented with feels, you know, about the climate crisis just can feel really overwhelming or too disconnected from our present day lives or locations. And it's easy to feel that sense of kind of apathy and hopelessness and the temptation to just disengage because it's such a big crisis. But by contrast, these artists are really deeply researching and immersing themselves in the science, and in some cases connecting their own bodies with the natural environment, and kind of imagining a world beyond humans even. And when I was invited to curate a show about the climate crisis at St. Francis College, which was ultimately titled Environmental Empathies, I worked with artists like Mary Mattingly, the Environmental Performance Agency, Nathan Kensinger, and some of the members of Biobat Art Space, among others. And what really struck me is whether the work was kind of more didactic or overtly activist in nature, or simply kind of representational and imaginative. I think all of the artists working in this space can really help us put ourselves in the shoes of the communities, as well as the plant and the animal life affected by climate change, and help us feel more connected to both its effects and potential solutions. So just a few things to think about. And with that, I'd like to present each artist. I'll read their bio, and then they'll each have 15 minutes to present their work about, and then we'll do kind of a group discussion and finally take audience questions from the chat. So a reminder to please put your questions into the Q&A box. So I'll start with Annalisa Jensen. She combines art installations with local research, interpersonal engagement, and communal actions. She holds an MFA in Visual Arts from Hunter College, CUNY, and an MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago, Illinois. At Hunter, she was awarded the Hunter College Foundation Scholarship for exchange studies at the Slade, London. Among the places she has exhibited her work are Edward Hopper House, New York Center for Book Arts, AIR Gallery, Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning, Bronx Art Space, Flux Factory, the Old Stone House, and Biobat Project Space. She has presented her work at the conferences of National Women's Study Association, Open Engagement, and the Alice Austin House Museum, as well as discussed it on NPR's Brian Lara Show. To realize her project, she's received funding from Manhattan Cultural Council Arts Fund, Queen's Arts Council, and Norges Commune in Denmark. So I'd like to turn it over to Annalise.
Thank you for that introduction, Catherine, and thank you everybody for creating this conference and being part of it and participating today. And I'll go on to sharing my screen. And so let's see here. So I will introduce QRC for VC and talk about, in a way, the story of that. And then to your left, you have where I live now, which is by the Verrazano Bridge in Southwest Brooklyn. And the view is of the Verrazano Bridge. And I basically work where I live and also where I grew up. So I had gone from working with community gardens on West 103rd Street to then living by this bridge. So I was interested in what can I do that will also involve the environment. And the solution came to me when I read an article in the Times about Harbor Ring, that is a group that's fighting to get a bike and pedestrian lane on the Verrazano. And right now there are 3 groups that are advocating for that. So it's the Harbor Ring, and they just did a big ride last weekend. And there's a group that I co-founded with a handful of people here in Bay Ridge, Bikes Off Brooklyn, and then transportation alternatives. And we basically support using one of the existing lanes. So it could happen tomorrow. And I chose the picture with the Evergreen cargo ship because that's also emblematic of the climate crisis and global shipping. And one just recently got stuck in the Suez canal. And then to the right you have, and if everybody, I don't know if you can do this with the way that the screen is, but actually throughout this whole presentation, if you hold up your camera to my QR codes, they will scan to what the climate action is. So then I'm going to start with this quote from Klaus from a recent conversation that we had. Because how do you then link a local action to the big picture? And obviously that's decarbonization. And so the action on the bridge is not just part of that, but it's also about access to the bridge, making it democratic. And then the fact that people can use it, whether they want it for scenic rides or for transportation, or both. And so in my case, I decided for this presentation to put in the elements that go into my art practice in red. And it started, the emotion that it grew out of was definitely frustration. Because during our pandemic and lockdown, the MTA, which is the agency that grew out of Robert Moses' office, didn't open up a lane on the bridge when they use it as an excuse that it's traffic that makes it unsafe. And so it could have been really important, especially for essential workers. And we're facing, we still don't know what this pandemic is going to do to our economy. And so people might not be able to afford a car also. So it's not just a matter of getting cars off the road. You might not actually have the option to have one. So the very least as a society, I felt that we could do was then to provide green infrastructure. So in the picture that I did from my petition was then, and I wanted to target the New York's governor because they will be the only one with enough power to put pressure on the MTA, which are actually actively blocking the lane from happening. There's been some performance politics in terms of pretending that they would implement it, but there are plenty of articles showing that that is a fraud. So here I am with my Sunday Zoom friends. We all met on Sundays and pointing to the bridge a few days before I published it, and we got home just in time before the rains for Hurricane Isaiah that literally left in my neighborhood trees uprooted landing on cars. And so then I wanted to test it out as a flyer to see if people would sign. And so I do that by the Narrows, and that's where I have all of my interactions with people and discussions about the bridge. And it was very encouraging from the second I stepped out the door with this flyer. And you can see also from this that I'm playing around with the petition itself up in the upper left-hand corner, first to simply wanting to enlarge it. And then in the lower left-hand corner is the same day that I published the petition, somebody literally crossed the bridge on a bike, showing everybody how easily it could be done. And you can also find articles on that. Street Blocks did an article on that action pointed to what the region needs. This is a bike desert. And then this flyer, I wanted to elevate the flyer for the exhibition of where Catherine was the curator for Brooklyn Utopias. So I made 90 of them and kept to myself. So 88 of them going all around the old stone house, and then also some big banners, and then combined my petitioning on site with down by the Narrows. And then I linked Jane Jacobs because Robert Moses has a story with the old stone house. I thought, why not resurrect Jane Jacobs to do a bit of battle with him again. And then I integrated the illustration from from Bikes Off Brooklyn, where John Tomac, who is an amazing illustrator, he showed through this illustration, you can see how the one lane is being then used as a bike and pedestrian lane. And then you see the little QR code. And that came about through chance, because what I initially wanted to do was to have people sign the petition by hand and then do all sorts of things with these signatures. But that turned out not to be a practical solution. And there were some concerns also about vandalism. And Catherine actually was like, what about a QR code? So I was like, that makes sense. And at that time, I did not realize how technology had changed from when I first made one, where it was very cumbersome. You had to have a specific application to use them. And now you just open your camera phone. But that is where all the, my subsequent images came from, is that it's a 49 KB file. And here you have the inventor, and of course I had to scan the cake, and that goes to the Denso company. But they were working on the QR code for 2 years, experimenting with this sort of Go board. And then the story that he tells is that one day during lunch, he was looking at that high rise you see in the lower picture, in the lower right-hand picture, and seeing the top of that building and the geometric forms is what gave him the idea for the QR code design, so that you could pack more info into it and have it also then be faster. And so my use for the QRC is utilitarian. It has made it so much easier. And then of course, during the pandemic, then a lot of people also became familiar with it when in terms of no touch and menus for when restaurants were able to have outdoor seating. And then I started creating these intimate events, and some of it is by design, some of it is just simply because it's a small community. I'm active only on Instagram, and that's also where I'm spaced all over. And then I'll announce, I try to find things to celebrate. So in this particular case, it was, passing the first 1,000 signatures. And it literally just passed 2,000. So now I'm going to organize another event, and I'll announce it on Instagram. And then I started playing, continued working with the QR codes. And so, obviously when you're then looking at these squares, I started wanting to just play around with the two people that I was thinking of was Malevich and then Albers, because of their history within design, abstraction, and revolutionary history. And so in this particular case, the futurists, the supremacists they were called, and it had to do with the supremacy of color, so not race, and as opposed to representational. And Stalin made Malevich paint, he was forced into painting representational art at the end of his life, very miserable ending. And Albers, Joseph Albers and Annie Albers were associated. They were part of the whole Bauhaus. And so, of course, then it was Hitler who made their life impossible. And then they came to the States. And so that's where I was looking at his squares and also color theory. And these all scan. And then there's chance and experimentation. And I do think that that's where artists' practice overlaps a lot with scientists, because sometimes things just happen and then you might be able to use it or you might not. But in this case, my large printer, the print had clogged for one color, cyan, and then you will have to buy a new print head, which is almost as expensive as a new printer. And I was like, no, with abstraction, as long as it then still scans, then I'll just keep on experimenting and to see how I can mix colors, and the light cyan still works, but it affects the colors. And then sometimes they will not scan. And so then I decided, well, then I'm going to recycle. And the ones that don't scan, I'll turn them into objects. So first I was testing with as tablecloths and as pillows. And then I started using my imagination to think of how could I come up with sort of from my inner world, what I'm thinking about if I just let fantasy go wild. And so humans, you know, it's gone from the exploration of space to colonization of space. And will you then, as a species, will we start making snow on the galaxies, you know, like you do in the desert, and all sorts of things, depending on what the QR codes looked like. So still having them relate to what I think, and most people think is the biggest issue we're facing. And then this became, as long as we can see the stars. And then I put the pillows, and these are all paper pillows for now, made of my prints. And then I put them on some small benches that I had. And then they became part of the show at the Biobat project space, which is upstairs. And it was the first one. And the space is focusing on climate. And then I also made libraries of the ones that don't scan so that I can recycle my prints. And then I had picnics for the opening, and of course kept it small because of the pandemic. And then for the closing, these are sketchbooks, and then I write the title on the first page, and then to have it open for others to fill out the rest. And for these, I started seeing maps of rivers, and the Narrows by the Verrazano Bridge is a strait. So that's why I call it Tidal Strait. And then QRC for VC is for the Verrazano. And the notebooks. And so this is then from the installation, the same here. And then for the ending, so organizing is also part of it. And it's not what I enjoy. Where I am happiest is in my imagination, but I don't want to just be there. And I think that by organizing and bringing people together, then you're continually building a community. And so there were speakers, a lot of them that are part of this conference, as well as my biking community. And to the right, you see Brian Hedden, without whom there would not be a Bike South Brooklyn. And some of the bikers, cyclists were also in the band, and IE was playing there with IE's band. And so it was organizing a program for the closing, and we could spread out because it's still tricky with the pandemic, but we were able to spread out because it's such a big space. It's the Brooklyn Army Terminal. And then, so this is obviously a lot of the conversation has, for this conference, has focused on like, you know, is it too depressing? Is it this or that? How I work is that I just want facts. It's the same if I'm sick, tell me what it is and what I can do. And so I think the main thing for people is to find people who work in a way that you're comfortable with. If you don't want these sort of statistics, then find people, you know, where you can still do things. I personally want them because it just deepens the whole experience of what it is that is going on. And so a friend of mine, Mike Keller, last month organized a talk by Bill McKibben at his university in South Dakota. And one quote that he did for that Zoom we had, I double checked with him, because sometimes, you know, the translating that takes place for these Zoom talks can really mess up what's being said. And I just wanted to double check, because I haven't read Falter yet. And so I was like, is it really like the carbon that's being trapped, is it really the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs a day? And yeah, it was accurate. And the data is in there. So it amounts to 4 per day, amounts to 4 every second. So it's sobering, it's extremely disconcerting, but you don't have to go into the place in your mind where you become depressed. Depression is very different than sadness or mourning. It's its whole own thing. So taking in those facts, absorbing them, and then combined with joy. So in this particular case, I'm inviting all of you tomorrow. I'll be down for an opening of Bridges and Portals by the Openings Collective. It's on 60th and 1 block west of Columbus Circle. And again, I'll have the large QRCs and combine them with petitioning and meeting people, and then just one person at a time, building a community that's working together in this particular way. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to stop now. So it's tomorrow between 1 and 3 p.m. Okay, stop share.
All right, that was a really great presentation, and I love how it kind of brings up ways that artists can really creatively use tools like social media and QR codes and sort of interactive technologies in new ways, and maybe ways that are more creative than what, you know, the scientific community would be doing. I'm seeing a lot of great questions already coming in the chat. I think we will leave those until after every artist has gotten a chance to present, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So I would like to now introduce Simone Johnson. She's an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and cultural worker based in New York City. She mostly makes work about water. She is currently interested in wetlands, rivers, and the ocean. Her most recent work includes Deepsea Time Warp 2020 and Pitch Black in Nothing Stable Under Heaven, a showcase of Black art at Oxbow Gallery, as well as art, science, and design collaborations for climate resiliency and water futures, in collaboration with Green Space, Gen Space, New York City H2O, Works on Water, and other organizers, facilitators, and presenters. Johnson also has a background in urban agriculture, plant medicine, teaching artistry, and performance art.
Thank you, Catherine. Okay, so I'm going to put my screen up here. I don't know if you all can see me. Wait. Just going to go to share screen here. Sorry. Having a bit of, let's see, okay, so I share here. Hopefully you can all see my screen now. So I can't see anyone, I just see my screen. So hopefully you all can see my screen. And I have my Instagram account here. If you want to follow, if you want to follow me on my Instagram account, is where I share a lot of my work. You can also, I'm also happy to talk to people via email, and I can share my email. Hi everyone, my name is Simone Johnson, and as Catherine said, I'm an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and cultural worker based in New York City. And I just want to say thank you to Richard and Ariel and Celia for inviting me to share at this conference. And I'm going to start by sharing about my work and go into my personal experiences with science, and then end with some thoughts on water futures. So my water art practice started a few years ago. I made a piece about water at a residency at Snug Harbor Cultural Center in Staten Island. And then I got another residency with an organization called Works on Water, where there's a community of people making work about water, with and on water. And it just really inspired me to develop this water art practice. And so 70 to 75% of my artistic practice is dedicated to water. And just a little bit more, my water art practice is guided by curiosity, intuition, exploring, and my interest in learning. It's slow, long-term, and interdisciplinary, many times inquiry-based, solo and collaborative work. I'm really grateful to be collaborating with so many different people on different water projects. And I would really love to collaborate on local and global water projects. A lot of the recurring themes in my work are around identity, communication, spirituality, time, and self-expression. And because I'm so water heavy, I am interested in learning about and honoring the other elements. And just overall, I just want to have fun and to test out ideas. My water art practice also includes getting out on the water and being in the water. These are photos from my first time sailing on my birthday last year. I thought I was gonna die leading up to it. I had all these scenarios about dying, and I made it through, and I learned so much. I learned how to navigate the sailboat, and it was really cool to be surrounded by water in this way. I took a lesson with Hudson River Community Sailing. So some of my work includes the other origin, which I showed at Water Art is the New Land Art, an exhibition at the Works on Water House on Governor's Island. And I filled a big glass bowl of water and placed it on a mirror, asking people to peer into the bowl of water. Another project, Mami Wata or Mother Water. Mami Wata is a water spirit or many water spirits recognized throughout Africa and the diaspora. And my Mami Wata practice focuses on many things. One of them connecting water to Black communities, Black cultures, and exploring Pan-Africanism. And I'm still learning about Mami Wata. So far I have connected this practice to Afrotectopia, which is a creative technology, art, and design space for Black people. I've learned so much about technology in this space, and I definitely think technology plays a role in climate change. I've also connected Mother Water to Black quantum futurism, which is a duo of artists based in Philly who explore time, temporality, Black temporalities. And so these aren't formal partnerships or collaborations. This is just me being interested in their work and wanting to connect my thoughts around Mami Wata to their work. And here's another project. I just also want to say that with the way that I work is that I just go back and forth between projects because all of them are long-term. And this one is called The Oceans Are Changing, and it's under a bigger umbrella practice called Oceanic Wandering Ways of Knowing, where I wander through the ocean. And it just so happens that my first wandering has taken me to the abyss, where I'm researching the impact of climate change on the ocean. And I'm still getting clear on whether or not the abyss is being impacted by climate change. I did find a study that said the abyss was being impacted, but then I found another study that said it wasn't. And so the first iteration of the oceans are changing is called ocean radio. And this is when I first started researching the relationship between climate change and the ocean. I had no idea about anything. I didn't even know the ocean was connected to climate change or to climate. So, and I collaborated with two people, and one of them was a bioartist named Leah Harper, who made these algae lamps. And we worked with the species of algae called Nanochloropsis. And I felt like I was collaborating with algae, and algae has been a collaborator since. And I have a lot of thoughts about this performance. I feel like I could have done it better. And then the second iteration is called Deepsea Time Warp 2020, which is a photography series I did late last year. I was asking myself, how can I make art during this time? And Deepsea Time Warp connects to what I feel like was an actual time warp last year. I don't know about anyone else, but I just constantly had conversations about time and how weird time was. So this project also continues to weave in research about climate change's impact on the ocean. And I'm also looking up ocean policy proposals like the Blue New Deal. So I really just leave the viewer or the audience to interpret the photos. I recently showed this series in an exhibition and wrote a work in progress piece of writing called Pitch Black. And an excerpt, I've talked to an ocean scientist to make sure I'm understanding how climate change is impacting the ocean and to gain clarity on climate information that is confusing. She recommended I take a course on oceanography. In our conversations, I noticed that we had to do a lot of breaking down and clarifying, which I saw as a form of translation. We understood each other, but we were speaking in different tongues, her as a scientist and me as an artist. We would use different words that meant the same thing. This is why in my artistic practice overall, I'm interested in communication. And if you want to read that piece of writing, it's on my website at www.dancewithsimone.wordpress.com. And so I'm really interested in inquiry and communication among scientists and artists and what we make space for. I feel like scientists ask questions artists may not get, and artists ask questions or interpret in ways that scientists may not get. And I think having more public and private, or more private and public facing conversations between artists and scientists around specific topics and research could be really interesting, seeing the conversation itself as a project or a collaboration. And then another, oh, I don't know if the video is going to show up. Let me see. Last year, I also participated in Walking the Edge, which was a collaboration between Works on Water and the Department of City Planning, where artists around the city would move and make art around the 520 miles of shoreline that make up the city. And at that time, I was living in Jackson Heights, Queens, but I grew up in Staten Island. And so I wanted to go there to do my project. So I took the Astoria Ferry to Pier 11 in Lower Manhattan. I think it's Pier 11. And then I walked to the St. George Ferry, and then I took it to the St. George Waterfront, where I grew up near. And I was playing around with this idea of New York City as a coastal city being in communication with Atlantis, or the legend of Atlantis. And in this video, I say you have to take this ferry to get to Atlantis. And there's a lot of stuff around Atlantis that is really controversial and unclear and weird. So I wanted to take part in shaping and reimagining and telling this story, since so many people have done that already. And at the same time, a big part of my walking the edge is asking and researching how is New York City preparing for climate change. And during this process, I realized how little I knew about New York City Council and local politics. And that was a really big takeaway for me. Okay, let's see. So I recently collaborated with GenSpace. Beth and Jasmine were presenters in the previous session, and more amazing organizers and presenters to create this series, Art, Science, and Design, Collaborations for Climate Resiliency and Water Futures. And after being in different science and tech spaces, I was wondering like what would happen if we connect water to these other disciplines and create like a convergent space around the future of water. And I'm so grateful for everyone who made this happen, all the folks listed down here. It wouldn't have happened without each of these people. And so I wanted to include my story of like, how did I even get to GenSpace? How did I even get here? And hopefully I'm good on time. So how did I get to GenSpace? Well, first in 2000, I grew up, I did science projects as a kid. I learned about science, but somehow along the way, I forgot about science. I literally forgot about it. And in 2019, I attended and presented at Art of Science, Science of Art, Working with Water in a Changing World. And around that same time, I was connecting to the Urban Soils Institute in New York City, and they have an artist extension where artists and soil scientists can work together. So I was being exposed to art science collaborations. But I wasn't like, I was just like, oh, this is cool. And then I found myself in upstate New York at the Sanctuary for Independent Media, which is an amazing organization. And they have a community science lab called Nature Lab. So first, I never even heard of the word community science. So I was floored by hearing that. And then I was being exposed to a lot of bioartists. And that blew my mind even more. And there was this one workshop. So I apologize in advance. There's a cuss word on the next slide. I'm sorry. This is a screenshot of an Instagram post I took where I went to a workshop with an artist who was working with a geneticist. And they were doing a workshop about genetic engineering, genetic modification. And we made these creatures to understand what is going on. And I say, I never realized how much sci-fi exists outside movies and books. Before my Chimera creation, there was
It looks as if we have
Sorry.
lost
Oh, I'm
Simone.
here. I'm here. My computer overheated.
Okay.
My
It's
computer overheated, but that's.
We're living in a Zoom world.
We are, and this always happens. But I'll just finish it. I can just talk.
Metaphor for climate change again.
And I'll hurry because I just probably disrupted the time. But I was just like my mind was blown from that workshop. I was like, who are these bioartist people? And this is where I also learned about GenSpace. So I said, I have to find my way to GenSpace. And that's how I ended up there. And then I had this other slide about what is science. And I hate that the computer went out, but I'll just, I think.
We can hear you.
Okay.
So if you want, I can play your slides for you on my end.
Oh yeah, I would love if you did that.
Okay, I can share my screen.
Okay, the next one is, the next slide is what is science? No, I'll hurry up here. Just that I had a slide that says, what is science? And to me, science is magical, it's odd, it's provocative, political, stunning, scary, and powerful. And I think science is art. And I'm drawn to many different sciences, especially bioart, because it deals with changing or altering life. And last year I had a chance to be in an international group of bioartists talking about the pandemic, and just the questions and the conversation that was being generated was so amazing. It's too bad that slide, that darn slide. I don't know if you're able to get it up. Oh yes. So it was just like, you know, I consider myself an interdisciplinary artist, not a bioartist, but just the language that bioartists were using and the questions they were asking. These are just something I took from my notes. And then what is art? And I'm gonna wrap up here. So for me, art can change you. Art can disrupt your assumptions, your thoughts, and your beliefs about something. Art is all sorts of things. And for me, it has been illuminating, shocking, funny, feel good, and has opened me up in all sorts of ways that to a certain extent has shattered my religious upbringing. And art is definitely political. So sometimes I wonder if science is open to or can handle the political nature of many artists. I think I'll end because even though I had another slide, I think I'll end by saying that science itself can take you to all sorts of places, and art itself can take you to all sorts of spaces. And so it's like, what happens when you combine the two? And so thanks for listening.
Thank you, Simone. That was great. And I think that it really it's great to raise these questions about, you know, do we even need to draw a distinction between art and science, and that kind of process of inquiry or collaboration itself could be the work of art in a way, which I think is really interesting to explore further, and kind of what artists bring to the table uniquely in that sort of process of inquiry and collaboration. So I'd like to go to the third presentation before we go to our Q&A, which is Yulia Parnisha-Kotis. She's a designer, researcher, and visual storyteller using emerging technologies and traditional techniques to engage audiences in digital and physical spaces. Currently, she develops and produces visual stories for the New York Times. Her previous work includes interactive experiences, spatial installations, motion design and animation for cultural institutions, digital advertising campaigns, and children's television. In her free time, she is a passionate illustrator, animator, and amateur folklorist.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I'm staring into a bunch of black boxes on a screen, so I feel very awkward. But thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure being here. I am going to share my screen. So let me know. Can you see me? I'm good? Okay, I'll take it as a yes. Let me get everyone off my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
We can see. Thank you very much.
Let me navigate back. So, hello, I'm Yulia Parnisha-Kotis. So during the day, I am a visual storyteller, a visual journalist at the New York Times, and a lot of my work, for the most part, is very data-driven. It uses a lot of emerging technologies and 3D, which is what my background is in 3D animation and all kinds of motion. And so I've been using these skill sets to report on issues dealing with a variety of topics, often science. It's so much fun to visualize, sometimes climate change, but it all looks like what you see here, which is very usually digital in nature and is drawing on data to make art. So what I'm going to talk to you about today looks very, very different. So, you know, this is what I do by day. At night, I am more of a traditional illustrator, doing work that has a lot of nature in it. I realized just going through my old pictures, they all have trees and very strange creatures traversing those forests. So I love fairy tales, I love folklore, and this is the kind of work I do when, you know, the kids are asleep and the household is quiet. So this kind of work doesn't often creep into my, you know, job as a visual journalist, but was very lucky to work on a story recently with a climate desk where we wanted to do a climate guide for kids. And now this is a scary topic, and I'm gonna just hold on to your socks for coming out of my presentation mode into the story. But so we wanted to introduce this topic that can be really scary, and we wanted to engage kids. When I say kids, we were aiming for like 8 to 14, someone who can digest this information and interact with it, but it still needs a kind of a safer place to be. And so, we created this world and a journey. Our message that we wanted to get across is that, climate change is happening now, but there is a bit of a fork in the road. And so it's for the next generation, there are choices that we can make that can make our future very different depending on what we do about it. And so, this journey, we wanted to personalize it. And Catherine mentioned the word empathy, and empathy is something we really wanted to get across. And so we created this world that starts out in a home where a character is about to set off on a journey. And so you get to kind of see an inside of a home with all the electricity used today, and then you set off into the world of today and kind of on this linear journey, follow our character on a bike ride through all the causes and drivers of climate change as they stand now. And I'm going to carry you very quickly through it, but you go on this linear journey, and then you descend into one kind of future. So if we don't do anything about those drivers that you've seen, you're going to go down a fairly dark path. And again, this illustration style, our hope in using it was to make this scary topic of the fires, things that the kids are already seeing today, but making them, be able to digest it in a visual world that is less frightening. And so, we go through all the things that, the bad things that can happen. And then this digital kind of journey starts to go backwards and talks about like, what if we did do something about the things that, the drivers that are causing climate change now. And so we're going backwards in time, or backwards in, this landscape of climate change causes, and, look at the world as the way that it could be, not ideal, but the better future. So it's the idea of the bad future and the better future. And it's a semi-circular journey that brings you back. And this character, through whose eyes you're hopefully seeing this world, comes back home to hopefully a better future that is possible for us, that we deserve. That's the story in a nutshell. Let me go back to the presentation, and I just want to present kind of like behind the scenes of how we made it. And all of it is obviously rooted. I say obviously because of the nature of my work as a visual journalist, journalism being the key word. All of it has to be rooted in fact and in the reporting. And Julia Rosen, the writer and the reporter for the story, did an incredible job. For the other stories I've showed you, sometimes I do jump in as a reporter as well. For this, I was purely a visual interpreter of the research she was doing. And so our challenge is taking, the information that is visually presented as you see on top and translating into this world that is, rooted in fact, but is this kind of a whimsical, more poetic, imaginative landscape. And so, how do you translate what oil drilling looks like? How do you explain at a glance what greenhouse gases are and what they look like? So every kind of whimsical image of these kind of naive looking houses on stilts is rooted in a lot of research that Julia did, and I help with the visual aspect to it as well. So a lot of the work is taking something that is science and transforming it into this kind of more painterly form. It's a lot of like the art itself. It was a lot of like the video will not play and I will not make you sit through it, but it's a lot of like oh, there we go, very slow and painstaking painting. So it's gouache on paper, for some reason filmed in slow motion. What was I thinking? And it's a lot of like basically hours and hours of me painting trees and nature and this landscapes at night that were basically done in parts. So it's a lot of like tiny little bits and pieces. My secret is that I love illustration, but I'm actually a fairly crappy illustrator when it comes to like pure traditional like way of putting the whole story on a page at once. So I cheat. I'm a digital artist, and I assemble these tiny little Frankenstein pieces of bits and pieces of people and places and like cows and buildings. And I work, I scan them in and I work digitally on my crazy spaceship of a digital setup at home in the attic. And, starting out with very detailed storyboards that are all rooted in the reporting and a lot of like planning, assembling those like scanned Frankenstein pieces of art into, these like very long panos that, hopefully look like a cohesive piece of more traditionally made art. And behind the scenes, this is what it looks like. I'm assembling this continuous journey visually of the squash watercolor landscape that has to flow as a single kind of in a single motion, as a single scene. But there's a lot of art. So anyone who works digitally, this is like, these panos of paintings are extremely high resolution. They're like 55,000 pixels wide each. A lot of computer horsepower, ironically, for something that looks so handmade. And so these are then cut up and plugged into our interactive framework that we've done for a few other pieces. I collaborated with our amazing news designer, Annalisa Jensen, who created this kind of, and helped evolve this way of like scrolly telling, basically going, across and down and up and down and back, as a way to like journey through art. And so one of the biggest challenges, which is kind of maybe not easy to think about when you're just reading the thing, is, where, again, it's, the output is very practical, the art is whimsical, but the output is practical. People have to look at it at a bunch of devices, from desktops to mobile phones to iPads. And so, the painstakingly made art, like when I'm showing you these storyboards, part of the layout process is to accommodate this view, which is what a desktop view would be, and how text lives in this landscape, because it has to relate to the art that it's overlaid, but it's not in a book. Like, you have no control what device person is looking at. So, going from like a desktop to a mobile device where we have to chop up the text to fit on the small screen, and it still has to correspond roughly to the piece of art it's lying on. Oh my God, I'm so excited about it, I'm spitting. So, there's so much unartistic but very important work that, and a back and forth between like Julia Rosen, the reporter, and myself with the art, and Annalisa Jensen, who is, helping lay out the text and like think through the interaction. That a lot of behind the scenes work. And then, we also have the print paper, which is a very different beast. And so we worked with an art director to be able to reinterpret this as, reusing the same art, which, that's where the power of digital art comes in, reusing the same art, but laying it out completely different. And so with this, we could have fun of truly making it a fork in the road, where you could take like the bad path versus the better path. And so that's that for this story, a more traditional style visually, but still kind of built on the backbone of the kind of very digital, computer intensive work that I do. So thank you. You can see my more traditional work with all the creatures on Instagram. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And some of my, all of my New York Times stories are at newyorktimes.com/by/Yulia Brashina-Kotas. So thank you so much.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you all. These were, such informative presentations. It was so great to see your process, Yulia, and how you have adapted it to different media. And that one thing that was really interesting, I think, that your presentation brought up was there's still a space for that really, immersive kind of time-consuming, laborious studio practice that's associated with artists, within this very urgent conversation about climate change that we're having. So I think that that was really interesting to see that you still have that kind of element of your artistic practice, as I'm sure others do as well. So I guess what we'll do is I'll ask a couple of general questions for the panelists, and then we'll try to get to other questions that may come up in the chat. And I'm sort of seeing some questions that from the chat that kind of tie into questions that I had in general for you. I guess one of them being, there was specifically a question about Annalisa's petition and how people have responded to the, whether they're in support of the bike lane or not. And I guess that kind of ties into a larger question that I had about, how do you define, quote unquote, success in your work if you're kind of engaging with these communities and issues directly? Is that even something that's important to you? And, how do you know that your work has had an impact or is successful?
So thank you for the questions. And I also saw that there was one about methane, and that's also an issue in a climate crisis. And yes, of course, absolutely no disagreement there. It was the quote from Klaus was specifically in connection with the Verrazano Bridge and taking 1 out of 13 lanes. The 13 lanes for cars, so using one for bikes and pedestrians. And so in terms of how people respond, that's where joy comes into. I'm having so many wonderful conversations, and it must be the easiest petition in the world to bring to people, because I would say about 90% of the people that I approach end up signing and being very excited about it and really wanting it. And of course, it's also then people that I'm meeting are people that are down by the waterfront on their bikes or walking and already close to the bridge and have an invested interest in making it happen. And then, so that's obviously a positive. Those are positive encounters that you can have within a serious setting. And then also in terms of the technology, because that was another a question that I saw about making it accessible to people, seniors and that might not be so familiar with technology. And that's actually exactly what happened in the history of the QR code, that people in Japan did not use it as much because it's an aging society as people in China. And that's where it really caught on and has been very active for a long time. So in terms of that, for me, is then when you have the underground interactions, what happens a lot is that kids will grab the phone from their parents because they're already familiar with the scanning. If it's a person who does not, who hasn't scanned before. And then if there is no phone, well, then I have my flyers, and it's just like, well, then you can have that. And then if you come across somebody, or I just give them, all you have to do is Google, petition Bike the Verrazano. And also harboring has been, when they do events, they share the petition. So what happened on Sunday, there was a stack of the petitions on the table that people can take. So that way, that's a form of outreach. And I would say in terms of success, it's always so hard. But I think it's fair to say that it reactivated, it became sort of a catalyst for a lot of actions in terms of harboring. So that's obviously good to see. And then also, I think that's it in terms of the questions that I saw. Okay.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question about kind of how to know that your project has been successful, or what you're hoping to, I guess, in terms of outcomes?
I feel like for me, when it comes to climate change, and maybe for a lot of my work, is that I just want to know what's happening. Like I feel like I'm coming from it from a learner's perspective. That there's like so much information, and I feel like I haven't even really delved into like hard data, if that's a term. I just feel so overwhelmed. I feel like I have to be like a learner, and then my artwork is mostly people seeing what I'm learning. I do care about conveying accurate information. And I do care about like real world changes, but I kind of feel like a lot of things happen. They happen at the individual level, but also thinking about the policy level, and just trying to give myself space to learn, because I feel like, I don't know for anyone else, but like learning about what's going on with climate change feels like a steep learning curve, because you could be in the abstract and know that like, wow, this is happening. But then when you start honing in on the specificity of how the world is changing, it can just be a lot. And I feel like when I observe science is so specific. Like there'd be a research project on like the eggs of a specific bird during the spring season. So it's really interesting to that. I feel like there's some type of understanding of how massive climate change is, or just to learn about something. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think for me, so I mean, my job is taking complex scientific topics, or not always scientific, and then just translating them into like simpler visual explanations. And for adults, you know, just hearing feedback that someone understood or learned something in a different way is so gratifying. But the project that I presented specifically for kids, you know, kids are so honest, and you know, that just I sat down with my daughter who's 4, my oldest, which is totally outside our range that we were aiming for. We were aiming for older kids, but I kind of walked her with simpler words through the project. And we were looking at trees, and I said, you know, like if we plant more trees, they can help eat pollution, you know, and very simple language. And that stuck with her. And then she just like repeated it again and kept referring to it. And like seeing that impact on one little person, and that like through the artwork, it's stuck in their mind, and you know, got the wheels turning. It's just probably like the most special thing about making art as an explainer for me.
Great. I have a 4-year-old too, and I can't wait to show her that book now. So I think that's those are all really important points, especially, you know, sometimes that change within yourself as an individual, and just the idea of learning and sort of showing, and maybe that can be an example to a broader public of the process of educating, or kind of immersing yourself in, you know, really understanding what's happening and, you know, empathizing with it. I think one of the other the question in the chat that was about, you know, how do we reach populations that don't have maybe smartphones or good internet access or technology? It sort of raises a larger question I had about, you know, how do we reach these kind of harder to reach populations? Is that something that's part of your goals as artists with this work? I guess I'm kind of thinking about also like the sort of distrust of science right now with, you know, fake news and sort of the public not necessarily believing in one set of uniform facts. You know, is there a way that artists can help reach people who, you know, might not consume the New York Times or mainstream media, or kind of listen to the respected advice in the science community, as well as just, you know, underserved populations that don't have access to, you know, some of the tools that we're kind of giving them to engage with climate change or to make changes in their own personal lives. So how, you know, I guess you could speak to your experiences with that.
I'm jumping in if no one else goes, but this, you know, outside of my work for like a newspaper, personally, I am obsessed with libraries and, community spaces in general. I mean, Annalisa is clearly someone who's so connected to like her community and being able to outreach that way. But I think libraries need to be rediscovered and, funded in a greater way, because they're such a great space for people of all walks of life to come together. And, they already try to engage in so many different ways, in terms of like activities that they organize and connecting with people, who make things, including artists. And I just think would be such a wonderful, place where artists can, engage with people in their neighborhood and beyond their neighborhood.
And I'll just repeat that being physically present for the petitioning, being able to hand a physical flyer to somebody, that is part of that strategy as well.
Yeah, and I feel like each person is like connected to different communities, different subcultures, and maybe just reaching the people who you're connected to. I think the community science spaces really opened up my world. But I think it's just like, where are those community science spaces, or whatever the space is, where is it being situated so that someone runs into it? Or, I'm not sure I would have even learned about community science unless I was upstate with the Sanctuary for Independent Media, and I'm really grateful for that experience. And then I do think a lot about older people. My grandparents actually pay attention to the news a lot. So, but then I wonder what else besides the news, like for senior programming or programming for older people that's not like the news.
Those are all really good points. And I know it's been like a challenge to kind of show up in person in different communities during the pandemic, but hopefully that won't be forever. And the idea of kind of reaching seniors and young people, I think is so important too. And I mean, have you guys encountered any sort of climate change skepticism in your work and had to deal with that?
Not particular for this work, but so Janine, who was one of the speakers yesterday, we were by the Narrows doing a letter writing campaign for political candidates, and just minding our own business, being busy with the card writing that was initiated by a friend of ours, Issa Del Bello, and boom, tables around us started chiming in, and Janine is usually so patient, and she is an educator, but I think everybody also just sometimes get exhausted, and then it's better just to sort of instead of trying to persuade somebody, then just leave it be, and then focus on the people that you can make vote and that you can work with. So obviously there's a different administration now, and so that's another aspect that I really think people can get involved in local politics. Two of the people that are also co-founders of Bike South Brooklyn are on our local community board, and I pitched to somebody running for office to be his artist in residence. So it wasn't as if I had to give up art, it was integrating art into a campaign space. And at Sunday's event, there was somebody there running for mayor who arrived on his bike and talked about how important this was for this to happen. So you can make it a thing where your election is not going to be possible unless you listen to a scientific community where there is largely consensus that the climate crisis is real. And then here's what, I propose to do about it.
Sorry.
You go ahead.
I was gonna say, I know the climate change is real. I'm sure you can use different words, climate change, climate crisis, because I feel like you can see that in agriculture. And I especially focused, I had an interest in seeds. And so like when you're selecting for seeds or you're growing for seed and the weather is changing, you really have to pay attention when it comes to growing food. I've run into climate skepticism from very few people, like one or two people. I've also run into people who have different worldviews. I feel like sometimes I feel like there could be an understanding that like people all around the world have different viewpoints and worldviews, and not everyone thinks the same. Because I feel like sometimes there's a surprise when someone thinks differently, and there's so many people who have different ideas of what's going on. And I feel like just understanding that first is something to do. And I've come across a few Native people who have particular worldviews about climate change. And so I feel like maybe I feel like it's really important to kind of listen to what people are saying and like synthesizing what people are saying. And I personally, some people may not like this, but I like saying, what is our relationship with the earth? Because I feel like that question can open up more questions. What is our relationship with the earth? And I feel like that connects to why we got here. Sometimes the urgency around climate change can be very stressful, and I feel like more questions about what is our relationship to the earth on these different scales is really important. Otherwise, I feel there can be a paralysis. And I think that dystopian ways of getting to innovation and generating ideas is great. It's nice. But I think it'd be great to ask other questions connected to climate change, because if you ask what is our relationship to the earth and you apply that to corporations, or you apply that to however the waste stream is structured, I feel like that will open up more than so the paralysis of this urgency, which, I mean, I think a panelist before, and I'll be quiet after this, a panelist before said that, she said something about this is a pivotal time. I think that this is a pivotal time, and we can make change. It's just that we have to literally make change. I hate saying we because it's so generalized, but can't perform anymore. We have to like start making these changes now. That, I know that takes a lot of work, and I don't want anyone to feel attacked, but I think this is a pivotal moment.
Yeah, and Simone, I was also I noticed in some of your past work too, it kind of deals more with those sort of personal changes that people can make in their lives. I know you've done some work around kind of sustainable cooking and health practices and medicine. So I think it's great to kind of show how that's all sort of interconnected and really affects people on a personal level. Would you say that's the case?
Well, lately I've been thinking about my recycling habits, and like trying to connect with bio designers, and just like I need to do better with my recycling habits, especially with the water art practice, and realizing that these larger systems are at play, but I also have a stake in setting up recycling systems in where I'm living at, or how can I compost better? And sometimes I feel like when people go to the individual place, it's like immediately like dismissed, and then we return to the systematic part of it all. But I think we can look at all of it together, you know.
Yeah, I think definitely the big picture. Does anyone else have anything to add around that question? Or I could also move on to one of the audience questions. There is an interesting question here. In view of the existential havoc that the climate disaster gives us, and I agree, it's, calling it a climate disaster or a crisis is most appropriate. Should the government enlist artists to present the nature of the climate emergency to the public, something along the lines of the FDRWPA program? I think that really also kind of speaks to that larger question of, is this work meant to be really practical and have, concrete effects, or does that give you enough kind of as artists and imagination? So what do you guys think about that idea of working directly with the government in that way?
I'm love that idea. I think it would be wonderful. I mean, it probably sounds really idealistic and naive, but I think facts can speak for themselves if expressed clearly and eloquently. And partnering, scientists and artists, as a public service to just state the facts. The idealist in me hopes that a greater, percentage of people can get on board with understanding what the science is, and the science is clear. Yeah, just laying out the facts in a beautiful way that can connect people on an emotional level would be such a wonderful thing for a government to do.
I absolutely agree, and I think it's very sad to see how effective a campaign by the Koch brothers to discredit the whole program of the 30s has put so much doubt in people's heads. But I think that it speaks for itself what was achieved, and now. So it's different times, different technology, but absolutely, if the government could be involved, that would be a good thing.
Are you asking if it's? Could you repeat the question again? I'm sorry.
It was a question that was from the chat about how the government might be able to enlist artists to present the nature of climate emergency. I guess if you're trying to maybe promote something like the Green New Deal or other climate related legislation, or and kind of made a reference to the FDR's WPA program from the 1930s.
I think as an artist, from my experience, I think that I would wonder if the government, like science, it's kind of hard to say those blanket terms, would be open to this, the political nature of a lot of artists. And I think that maybe some artists might be distrustful because there's a lot of artists, a lot of times are used to establish things that are kind of controversial. You can see that sometimes with development projects. And it's kind of hard to get away from the politics of everything. But I also believe in government entities that can change from the inside out. I'm not completely pessimistic about that. I do think that I wanted to respond to Lewis. I hope I said your name right. That I just think that life, a lot of times, at least for me, is like navigating different people's perspectives and worldviews, all while navigating information that may not be correct or accurate or is misrepresented. And there's a lot of, I feel like it's important to think critically and to make connections and to delve into history to understand why things have happened, how they have happened, to have like a more informed, well-shaped view of what's going on. Because as much as I just think that a reality is that I just think people are so different. But I do think the government has a stake. It's just that I think a lot of work would have to be done.
I guess it kind of also raises the question of, who else would you like to bring into the process, and what other kinds of skill sets do you feel like you had to develop as an artist in kind of these collaborative efforts or working with scientists? If not if the government might be problematic in some ways, are there other collaborators you found helpful in the past or that you'd like to work with?
For me, I think like working, with scientists who are all people much more brilliant than I could ever hope to be, was just, learning how to read a lot of papers and stacking up on my table, but also learning to accept that, to respect other people's expertise without expecting myself to, know everything, and like being able to freely admit to a person I'm having a conversation with that I don't know something, and listening and just absorbing. I really respect what Simone was saying about understanding people's perspectives and understanding that everyone, comes from a place of and life experiences that shape them and will look at the world differently, which also includes scientists. I mean, there are, working with scientists in scientific community, everybody has their own stake, their own perspective, their own reason, why they chose to study something, and different results. And, being as an artist, but also journalist, being able to look at all sides of the story, being able to pull out the facts and recognize them as facts, but also understanding that facts are made by humans, and, data is produced by humans, and being able to navigate the flaws in those. Presenting them honestly, whatever the flaws may be, was a learning curve, and I'm still learning on that and working on that, and being able to put my own passions aside when documenting work as an artist, it's hard but important.
Yeah, and I continue to be excited by local groups that are also forming. So not just the local bike activism group, but then also there's a recent group that formed here called Bay Ridge Environmental Group, and they've already posted both in Bay Ridge. No, it's actually a publication on Staten Island, because we're gerrymandered here into a district with Staten Island, South Brooklyn is, and our current representative is a staunch Trump supporter who hosted the Proud Boys. So there's a lot of stake in terms of people running for office, and so they published an open letter to her in terms of the environment with suggestions. There was no vitriol or anything. It was just completely, here's what could be done. And so, so it just seems like maybe because of the particular situation where we're sort of off the map here to a lot of people, that then there's a lot of people taking initiatives. So, and even within organizations, whether it's corporations or nonprofits, it's often the people that you work with, and artists are usually suspicious of both in terms of co-opting their work. So it's whoever you find while still being open, obviously, you know, because it's going to take a lot of coalitions to make something happen. So it's nice when you find people where you click and where there's trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about trust while you were talking, because I feel like sometimes the world is like a wilderness, and I actually think the world is a magical place. I think it's an actual magical place, and I'm like, I have to find some science communicators so I know what's going on. It's like it's like a movie where I have to find science communicators, but trusted science communicators, because sometimes I read like research, or I'm following people who are really into science, and at the end of it, I'm just like, what are you saying? I have no idea what you're saying. So when I can connect to a science communicator, which I know one person, and that person's able to translate all of these words, I have no idea what's going on. I sit there trying to understand, and they just so easily and smoothly communicate what's going on. I feel like those are people I'd really love to connect with, not only to help me with my own artistic practice, but it has to do with like trust. Because, for example, I don't know if I should give this example, but I always thought it was interesting, you know, for like scientists or researchers to know more about my body than myself, because maybe they've been researching it for years, or they've gotten funding to study a certain part of the body. And so it feels like wanting to have agency, wanting to know what's going on. And there is a level of power dynamic involved, I feel, in science. But I would love to connect with more science communicators. And I also think it's valuable to have artistic interpretation as well. And that I imagine artists, you know, I think I'm thinking through writing, but also the value of artistic interpretation.
So,
do we have time for another question, or are we kind of out of time?
We're sort of out of time, but one more question. Why not? Go ahead.
I think I just to kind of circle back, there was an interesting discussion at the roundtable last night about that idea of, you know, art for art's sake, if that has a role in this kind of conversation, and what the sort of responsibility is of artists, you know, to get the science facts right, and to, you know, present something that has an impact versus kind of a more maybe science fiction-y or imaginary, whether it's a utopian or a dystopian world that you're depicting. I guess I wanted to just get your very quick, maybe one sentence each take on that idea, if that's something you've struggled with in your work, or, you know.
Well, quickly, so in terms of time, I don't think we need to be having that conversation anymore, because not at this point in time. It's an old conversation. And right now, artists, it's a huge tent with so many practices, from social practice to people who are scientists, people who collaborate, people who integrate, like, you know, highly aesthetic works into activist work. It's all sorts of things that are going on, and it's really up to each person to allow themselves to make this work, because only you can know yourself fully in terms of what is going to make you easy to be around, because you're not going to be happy if you're making work you don't like making. And so I think there are many, many ways where artists can become platforms and catalysts as well, and it's not at the expense of aesthetics. So that's my quick answer to that.
So I you know, my daytime self that works as a visual journalist is a stickler for fact, and you know, my job depends on it, and I will talk to 10 people to get the most minute detail of my visualizations right as can be. But my nighttime self, who, you know, paints for pleasure and is so immersed in folklore. I think there's different kinds of truths, and there's the magic that Simone describes in the world, and that kind of so like that social and emotional connection that people feel to art can have their own kind of poetic truths that express concepts and a feeling and a sense of something that is not being dishonest, but doesn't have to be grounded in painstaking fact finding.
I feel like I'm having lots of thought crashes because I'm having so many thoughts, and I'm like, oh.
That's okay. You gave us plenty. Thank you very much. So this we've been getting, for the last day and a half, we've been getting to this point that is the point of wanting to hear from working artists who are revealing their processes, and we see so much of how art informs our lives, our discussions of things. And what has been interesting to me here as we go through, you see that art is now, and it always has been, I guess. So when it's just the marriage of technologies, and whatever technologies there are, whether it's rocks on a cave wall or some of Yulia's digital tools that she uses for her art. And so we see collaboration, and all these things are taking the modern form and looking at as we said, how art and science addressing the climate crisis, which art has always addressed whatever existential questions humans have, and what is truth becomes part of this. My background is a student of literature and novels, and so of course what a novelist tries to do is tell the truth by lying. So they make up a whole story. It's a whole lie, 500 pages of lies, but if it is done well, there is a truth there, and there's a truth about what it is to be human. And I guess that's what all artists do. So I think we're going to be closing our conference. We were trying to figure out if this is the 10th annual BWRC conference, the 11th annual one. We were not so sure as in the mists of time where we started. At any rate, thank you to our artists for your participation and your insights and your time. Thank you for the audience for coming here and listening to this. Thank you for Catherine for moderating this discussion. And thank you to my colleagues who are behind the scenes, but we have heard from them and been helped by them. We have Ariel and Celia who have been with us for a while. So with that, I think we will end this and bid you all adieu. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.